going to be late, so I don't know if anybody has any other apologies. No? No other apologies received. Right, can we move then to the next item, which is agenda item number 2, the draft minutes of the meeting held on the 2nd of December 2014, there from page 5 onwards. Are members content with the detail and accuracy of the minute? Agreed? Agreed, yeah. Okay. Wait a minute. Yuck here. Right. Quarters. So move then. The next item is to chairperson's business. And today the private dining room has been booked for a committee working Christmas lunch from 1 p.m. onwards. So members are content with that proposal. Okay. Agreed. Then I have to report as well that yesterday I met with William Irwin, the chairperson of the Agriculture and Rural Development Committee, around the, if you like, the collaborative monitoring of the agri-food strategy going for growth. So what we agreed to do was that probably post-election we would have a collective joint meeting of both committees to look at and receive updates on the agri-food strategy and see how it's moving. This was in agreement with what we should do before, because it's a cross-cutting strategy anyway. So that's just a report on that. Members will be duly notified anyway.
Is that going to be a regular thing, Patsy, instead of just a one-off thing?
Well, no, it's first of all we're going to have. We agreed that we would have the first meeting, and then that would probably be followed up by regular meetings, maybe at 6 monthly intervals or the like.
A regular thing as opposed to a one-off thing, because there's no point us getting a briefing and then
no.
Agriculture Committee getting the same briefing. Doesn't make any sense. Do the thing jointly, you know.
So that was agreed yesterday. Well, agreed with your permission as well and buy-in. So, right. Next item is Workers' Memorial Day. Page 14 is correspondence from the Irish Congress Trade Unions requesting that the committee sponsor the Workers' Memorial Day as it has done in previous years. The Long Gallery has been booked for Monday the 27th of April from 12 noon to 2 p.m. So if members are content, the committee sponsors the event. This is an annual thing that the committee does, so thank you for that. Now, agenda item number 4, oral briefing on the collaboration and cooperation in the life, health sciences sector. And we have written briefing on this from page 16 onwards. So, and briefing the committee today is Professor David Waugh, the Director of the Centre for Cancer Research and Cell Biology at Queen's University Belfast. Professor Waugh, you're very welcome indeed, and thank you for giving up your time to be with us here today. And I look forward to hearing from you. I know you've already briefed some of my colleagues here previously, so please, the format is basically you give us your brief, your synopsis of your document that you have here, and maybe add a bit to it, and then we have question and answers from members. Okay?
Okay, well, first of all, thank you very much, committee members, for inviting me here to present to you all today. The topic of discussion that I'd like to raise is really the transition towards a precision cancer medicine agenda for Northern Ireland, which integrates both implications for health, private enterprise, industry, and the impacts that will have on society in general. I'm Professor David Waugh. I'm the Director of the Centre for Cancer Research and Cell Biology at Queen's University, and I represent 300 active researchers. But I also am here indirectly in a capacity representing the healthcare workforce within the Belfast Health and Social Care Trust, the Department of Health, and all of the great work that they do in terms of frontline care for cancer patients. I'm also here on behalf of the cancer patients in Northern Ireland and all the families that are affected by this awful disease. Over the last decade, the survival rates for cancer patients in Northern Ireland have improved, but I believe that we're at a significant crossroads now in terms of the evolution of cancer service and how we build for the future. Northern Ireland has a very strong academic presence in this area, largely centred around our centre at Queen's University, but there's also a burgeoning life sciences sector now in Northern Ireland, where Indigenous companies are starting to actually demonstrate commercial activity relevant and to the growth of this sector, and actually starting to produce products that have global impacts. What I believe is needed in Northern Ireland now is an integrated vision where academia, fostered around the Queen's University Cancer Centre, healthcare around the Belfast Health and Social Care Trust and other trusts with a research presence in cancer, and these Indigenous companies come together to form an integrated framework by which we can actually use commercial activity and new products stemming from research to actually drive a research culture and a research prosecution of a cancer service, all dedicated to changing and improving outcomes for cancer patients. I believe this is achievable, but I believe that it also requires a dedicated and integrated commitment from yourselves and a significant investment to deliver this. What I intend and would love to see happen in Belfast is an opportunity to create an innovation hub where cancer research at academic level is actually appended to all of the commercial activities from our Indigenous companies. But in creating that infrastructure, you provide an attractive opportunity for other individuals to develop spin-out companies from research knowledge. So we will have Indigenous spin-out SMEs. You will have the framework to attract other small medium enterprises to relocate to Northern Ireland, which is already starting to happen, but we don't have the capacity to expand that. You will have the opportunity to bring and increase the footprint of major multinationals in the pharmaceutical industry, because we'll have the infrastructure to deliver personalised cancer medicine. And on that ground, I believe then that this expanded sector is critical to the further competitiveness of us as a cancer research community in Belfast and Northern Ireland, and in enabling us to grow this sector so that it becomes a self-sustaining entity. The evidence for this is founded on several measures of esteem that the centre itself has already created. We are a Cancer Research UK Centre of Excellence. There are only 15 across the country. Belfast competed for this and receives an annual investment of £2.5 million from Cancer Research UK to undertake these activities. It's a Movember Centre of Excellence, the first of its kind in the world, focusing on innovative care in prostate cancer. It is starting to drive a clinical trials base, providing state-of-the-art care to our local community based on assets and products delivered by academic and industrial researchers here in Northern Ireland. And what I believe we are starting to see is a concept that I proposed when I first took over the directorship 2 years ago, which is a Born in Belfast, led by Belfast personalised cancer medicine agenda. This is significant. But at the minute, the infrastructure that I have and my team have at our disposal is the limiting factor. We don't have the physical capacity and footprint to expand these activities. The industrial companies want to work very closely with us, because if you put the industry companies between the researchers which do the innovative aspect of discovery and put them in between with the patients, then you actually have the ability for companies to start to see rapid translation of their products into patient care, and that brings the commercial inflection value of the activities that they're undertaking. The benefit of this is clearly exemplified by some of the products that Almac, for example, have delivered in partnership with ourselves. Some of their biomarkers are now being taken up by major US corporations, out-licensed to them, research done in Northern Ireland, bringing commercial value back into the company, back into our sector. We know we can do it. We've joined up the pipeline. We can take the ALM-201, the ovarian cancer drug, the first cancer drug delivered in Northern Ireland, developed in Northern Ireland, discovered in a laboratory at Queen's, translated through Almac Discovery as a company, and now being pushed out into phase 1 trials led by the Belfast Trust and our Cancer Trials Unit in our centre, but now also starting to transition from being treating Belfast patients, but across the UK. We can join this pipeline up. We've demonstrated it. What I need now is extra capacity in that pipeline, the infrastructure to deliver it, so that I can oversee an improved cancer service focused on delivering these research assets into patient care. And as a result of that, I believe we will see improved cancer patient outcomes. But as a result, the connectivity is that you will have health gains, economic gains for Northern Ireland life science sector, which this committee oversees this document that says about innovation in Northern Ireland, and as a result you will have societal gain. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much indeed, Professor Waugh. See, the big issue here is clearly for yourself, expansion. What do you see as the obstacles to that expansion? And essentially from that, identifying problem, what's the solution to it and how we could potentially help?
There are several areas that I think need to be covered. First of all is the physical infrastructure. So the Northern Ireland Cancer Centre, a fantastic building, opened in 2006. And then there was the chemotherapy Bridgewater Suite in the Belfast Trust. I would say that the infrastructure that we have currently is just about sufficient to carry the burden of cancer care that the Trust needs to deliver at the minute. The problem is going to be that if we look into future-proofing that service, I think there are going to be concerns about whether that infrastructure is sufficient to carry the burden. It also means that at the minute the infrastructure is not geared in the way that myself and some of my academic colleagues, both on the clinical and scientific side, would like to see us being able to work. And that is to drive research through the infrastructure of the Trust in order that we can improve access and increase access of patients to cancer clinical trials. The evidence of why cancer clinical trials are so important is based on the fact that there are large studies which show that where patients have access to cancer clinical trials, invariably those patients do so much better in terms of their outcome and the level of care that they receive. I believe this is imperative to our mission, which we will all share in, which is to improve cancer patient access. So I believe infrastructure is critical, and that means that I would love to see an expansion of a dedicated facility to allow cancer clinical trial activity to progress, but importantly how you integrate that with diagnostics so that you can actually start to push precision cancer medicine. Precision cancer medicine requires diagnostics, new biomarkers to enrich patient populations so that you tailor the right drug to the right patient. When you put diagnostics and innovative therapeutics together, then you will have the framework and the infrastructure to deliver and improve cancer patient service. So I believe a new hospital facility of some sort is required where you can actually put the footprint together for cancer clinical trials on an outpatient basis, how you can actually marry up diagnostic service, therapeutics delivery, and provide also the surrounding infrastructure that enables industry to get round that. That's how you start to provide an attractive framework for SMEs to spin out and exemplify their products. I think infrastructure would be the major aspect in terms of the barriers. I do also believe that commissioning is an important obstacle that we need to look at and address. It's a different committee. I assume the Health Committee will deal with this, but I think we have to be more aggressive in terms of commissioning activities within the health service sector, particularly around rolling out molecular pathology and diagnostics. I think this is an imperative way in which we start to progress cancer care.
Right, okay. And then in terms of what we could actually do to help as a committee?
So I think what I would love to see is this committee be the champion of this type of vision, where academia, industry and the healthcare and trust organisations are brought together and actually map out a framework for how we could actually change this. I think you have the ability, the power and hopefully the budgets to try and roll out and integrate this type of vision. I think that's imperative, that we have political leadership in this space across all parties to help us effect this change for the significant number of patients in our community that are affected by this disease.
Okay, thank you for that. Now, you mentioned money there. This committee in particular has devoted a lot of its time to R&D and innovation, particularly in the context of the Horizon 2020 funds. So could you fill us in if there's been any work or any sourcing or potential sourcing of those types of fundings, or indeed other types of fundings?
Absolutely.
that can help out?
Absolutely, Chair. It's an imperative and an ever-present metric that I have to, as Director, address. So I can happily say that we have more than doubled the research income that our centre takes in every year over the past 2 years, sourced from major national charities, Medical Research Council, the Movember Foundation. The key thing now is about actually getting into the Horizon 2020, and that has been an area that we have started to address and submitted major programmes to tailored calls where we think we can be competitive. Obviously, this is a very competitive area in the European Commission. I believe the quality of our work stands up. I believe that we are doing very impactful things, and the work that we really are submitting to this is at the cutting edge and forefront of personalised cancer medicine. The issue is, as we all know, that these calls are very specific, and we have to make sure that the calls that are presented by the European Commission are actually the types of calls that we can actually compete in. And I think that's a very vital job that the ETI Committee, and particularly Invest Northern Ireland, can do in terms of the Brussels office, is actually having greater representation to make sure that the types of calls put out by the Euro Commission actually reflect the type of innovative life science work that's going on in Northern Ireland. Now, I'm confident still that we will do very well in the calls that are currently out there and the submissions that we are progressing with the European Commission. My goal is absolutely to tailor that, but the one thing that I would also say to you is those European Commission grants that in the Horizon 2020 are now very heavily dependent on the industry linkage and the commercialisation activity. And it's for this very reason that I believe that the vision I'm putting in front of you and discussing with you is exactly the way in which we will become increasingly competitive. Because if you grow indigenously your own companies, but then also roll out more SMEs or have the infrastructure to enable other SMEs to come in, the onus then is on the Northern Ireland sector to be in the space that becomes attractive, not just for organisations like myself based in Northern Ireland, but other universities across Europe to actually come and avail of the SMEs and the commercial activity in Northern Ireland. That's the challenge that I think we have. We have done very well in growing a life science sector from very low baseline, almost negligible 10 years ago, to an area now where we are having global impacts. You have two of the largest diagnostics companies in Europe actually within Northern Ireland in Randox and Almat Diagnostics. Both of them hitting above their weight, punching above their weight, doing great stuff, but now we actually have to have a broadening of that base as well.
And you're almost instinctively taking me into an area here where I was thinking of maybe going later on, and that's the lever of corporation tax to incentivise further input from the private commercial sector. Have you any views on that or any thoughts on it at all?
I guess that would be outside the expertise that I would bring to this table. However, I guess from any logical director's point of view, if you actually reduce corporation tax and the tax burden on a company, it does become a more attractive environment. I actually believe that an SME will look at different factors than corporation tax, per se.
Okay.
I believe that an SME will look more at the infrastructure, the framework and the connectivity that you can put in front of them to say, actually, this is somewhere where it's connected, and I can actually have the delivery of any product that comes out. Because the inflection value and the commercial value of any asset in the life science sector is wholly dependent now on exemplifying it in patient treatment. So can you take a drug and push it into phase 1 and show that the drug is safe? If that drug has a safety profile and even has efficacy at phase 1, then its value is probably multiplied by 10. And suddenly you then have large multinationals wanting to come onto this pipeline and avail of that asset. That's how you start to build value.
Right. Just for further wee bit of clarity to end off the detail, have you met with the Enterprise Minister or Health Minister to discuss what you've just told us?
Yes, I met with Minister Foster at the Bio Conference this year, and presented this type of plan. I also gave a speech at a bio breakfast that Invest Northern Ireland hosted, at which Minister Foster and Alistair Hamilton were present, and members of this committee were present, and I think that was very well received by an American audience of businessmen who, I think the result of which has been that several companies have actually filed papers to relocate to Northern Ireland because of the vision that I've sold.
Good.
The issue now is I need to have an expansion of infrastructure to increase that activity. I've also met with Minister Putz, who was then Health Minister shortly before he changed office. And Minister Putz, I think, was very supportive of this type of vision. I have yet to meet with Minister Wells to discuss this vision with him.
Okay, thank you for that. Mr McKinney, Fergal.
Thank you very much, Chair. And I was one of those who visited San Diego and saw at first hand the extent to which there's global interest in this. But back to home, and obviously the funding is going to be a crucial issue, and against the backdrop of cutbacks, etc., etc., etc. Clearly those who would be instrumental in making decisions around this would have to be assured that the risk is reduced in terms of investment. So how do we assure, and I imagine that this would be, and we'll get onto this later, that there'll be more cross-departmental thinking in this rather than a single department, though it wouldn't be without this committee championing it. So how do we assure departments and ministers, etc., that the risk is reduced?
In terms of defining risk as being, will the commercial activity happen? I think that's where you've got to actually speak to people within that sector. So I know, for example, through our partnerships with Almac, they have benefited tremendously from being part of that hub on the CCRCB campus. Brandox have talked to me extensively. I think there's always going to be risk in life science. There's no question about that, but it's how you manage risk. I believe that what we are trying to do here and trying to effect has international and widespread support. The fact that I am actually in advanced discussions with a company currently based at the University of Southern California and wishing to relocate, and they've actually had their international advisors go through our centre and say, this is exactly where you need to be because it has the right mindset. I think it's like anything else. You have to walk before you run. You need to demonstrate and have the evidence that you can deliver. I don't think the meeting in San Diego would have gone so well had it not been for the fact that I can stand up and honestly say, here is the evidence that I can take academic research and push it all the way into a phase 1 trial. And like anything else, I think once you've provided the evidence, it becomes an area that companies look at and say, okay, we've got to come and investigate. I've had academic leaders in the US, in discussions with them. I've talked about the vision that I've put in place, the evidence, the measures of esteem that have happened in 2 years. And they've looked and said, you know what, we need to come and look at your centre because that's exactly the model I need to be putting through in an American institution. I don't have that and I need that. I've talked to major pharma companies like GlaxoSmithKline, who came to visit as part of the ABPI visit in September. And when they've looked at what's happening in the cancer program around personalised cancer medicine, they've said, we've got to come back and we've got to talk to you about how we expand our clinical trial footprint in Belfast. Now, like anything else, I believe the pharmaceutical industry works in, well, if one company starts to do that, then the others shall follow. And I believe, like anything else, it's just a case of growing and demitigating the risk.
If we didn't do what you're asking government to do, would we miss the curve?
Yes. I believe it's not just missing the commercial curve, it's missing an opportunity which we have invested a lot of effort. We have delivered and brought a number of academic leads from across the world to Belfast to do, and the evidence now is that all of those individuals are delivering. I'm in advanced discussions with other academic leads across Europe and the UK to come and relocate to Belfast. And every time you start to bring more talent in, you increase the capabilities and the capacity to deliver world-class healthcare, research and commercial activity in this province. If the infrastructure becomes limiting, if the budgetary support becomes limiting, if the tap is turned off, then those individuals, world-class as they are, can as easily leave Northern Ireland as difficult it is to bring them here. It's easier for them to leave. And that is the risk that I see in terms of sustaining growth. The life science sector in San Diego, which I think several of you visited, was not built in a day, it was not built in a year, it was built as a result of long-standing investment in that sector. It is now probably second only to the Massachusetts cluster. This is a long-term game that the Northern Ireland Executive committed to in life sciences many years ago. You must stay with it. You cannot now turn off the tap. And that is an important aspect in terms of Invest Northern Ireland support. It has been critical to build the academic industrial partnerships. It's been critical to develop the biomarkers programme, the drug delivery programme, the drug discovery programme, and the opportunities that we now have for SMEs coming here to Northern Ireland. There will come a time where that sector will get to such a size that it starts to feed off each other. You have companies working with other companies in Northern Ireland, and the money and the health and the opportunities will all become self-sustaining, but it's not at that time yet. It's not at that period of evolution. And we're still 20 years probably behind in terms of infrastructure relative to several other UK areas.
It's clear from what you were saying in your opening remarks, the partnership between academia, healthcare and pharma companies are important. Are you seeing that reflected in departmental thinking across departments?
I think from my conversation with Minister Foster, I clearly was left with the impression that she understood the importance of cross-departmental working. I believe Minister Poots also registered that comment with me when I met with him in June. I can't comment beyond what I've witnessed in terms of face-to-face. I've not been privy to discussions here. But I do encourage you to think about that type of activity. I think it's really important.
Well, I was going to put it another way then, if you felt that, that you couldn't critique, if you like, the existing arrangement, but would it benefit more from greater cross-departmental thinking? And that wouldn't necessarily be just health and enterprise, it could certainly be others.
Well, I think there's a massive role here for employment and learning. I think what we are trying to do is also the education aspect that Queen's University is striving to progress world-class research in its infrastructure and its organisation. It's about how Dell can provide funding streams for innovative thinkers in medicine, clinical sciences, and all of the attributes that we need in terms of building this sector. So I totally agree. It's about how you actually train and use this infrastructure to train a workforce. And that is important for the employment and learning sector and department.
Okay. Just one final one briefly. In terms of, you're very much aware of the, and all of us are involved to greater or lesser degrees in asking for greater provision in terms of cancer drugs, etc., etc. Can you just briefly spell out the advantages then in pharma? You've touched on it earlier, but the advantages in pharma companies coming here and progressing that latest thinking in treatment. So
the Cancer Drugs Fund, as we're all aware, has been a major political and a societal issue this year. For those of you not fully briefed, it's the access to 38 cancer drugs which are available to patients in areas of England but not available in Northern Ireland. Obviously, my own belief is that access to cancer drugs and innovative cancer drugs is essential, but it's also how we use those in an informed manner. And What I believe we are trying to achieve with this vision is how we actually match up biomarkers, diagnostics and therapeutic provision, but pushing that into cancer clinical trials. And where you start to increase your clinical trials portfolio and you increase the number of patients going on to trial, then those innovative trials invariably bring access for those patients to many of the cancer drugs that we're trying to get into Northern Ireland. Not always, but a vast majority of them could go into the framework of clinical trials. And that becomes a very important aspect of how you work with the pharmaceutical industry in the context of research and research discovery as an enabling tool to increase the availability of these agents to your patient population. So that's how I see this vision is actually wrapped up in another way with the discussions around access to cancer drugs.
Okay, thank you for that.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you.
Mr. Dunn, Gordon.
Thanks, Chair. David, you're very welcome. I think we all appreciate your work and enthusiasm that you show about in relation to cancer research and the care in Northern Ireland, all the good work you've done. And I think we both, Fergal and myself, we're very much, I think, appreciate very much what you've done in San Diego, addressing the conference and the breakfast. I think you sent out a clear message and that Northern Ireland is open for business, and you want to push forward the whole idea of cancer research and development. Just on precision medicine, could you elaborate a bit more on that as to how you see it as being the way ahead?
So, I guess the way that we can look at it is if we take a cancer patient population at the minute, and if we use the terminology of standard of care, which is a term that as an academic we kind of frown upon, but if you use standard of care, you're invariably treating patients with cytotoxic chemotherapy agents. And cytotoxic chemotherapy agents are not only toxic to cancer cells, but they're toxic to your normal cells, and they do damage to your body. But there is a therapeutic window where we are killing more cancer cells than normal cells. So that's why, in some cases, they're effective. But if you give standard of care, the best ratios that you're likely to receive in terms of treating a cancer population would be 1 in 4. So in other words, 1 in 4 patients would be likely to have any clinical benefit. Therefore, for 3 of those 4 patients, you're giving them a drug which they will not respond to, but which they are having some significant impairment of their quality of life, and you're making them very ill. Personalised cancer medicine is a different approach. The theory is that we can start to tailor the right drug to the right patient at the right time. And that's by having a broad range of knowledge about the genetic and biological basis of a tumour that a patient is experiencing or suffering from, having the knowledge about what are the driving biology there and therefore where the right therapeutic intervention would be, and then providing the diagnostics and the therapeutics together to actually put them onto the right treatment regimen. And invariably, precision medicine has the promise of greater chance and probability of having clinical benefit in the patient, but sparing them the toxicity that we would actually achieve using the standard of care. And cancer patient treatments are getting that balance right, optimising the clinical benefit, reducing the side effects and the toxicity. And that's what personalised cancer medicine is. And what we're trying to fashion in this is a framework by which you empower the diagnostics piece, both the requirement for new discoveries of new diagnostic tests, also commissioning those that are available and rolling those out so that we are treating our patients in an informed manner, and then using clinical trials to expand the armoury of drugs that we have available from existing stocks within the pharmaceutical industry, but also empowering new companies, new SMEs and existing SMEs to deliver new tailored therapies that can then be brought into clinical trials. That's what this vision's about.
Okay, great, thank you. One of other issues, your links with universities. I understand you have strong links with Queen's University and so on. And
Yes, I'm a member of academic staff at Queen's.
yes. And how do you see them moving forward in relation to developing further developing cancer care and research?
Well, I can only praise Queen's University in terms of the support and the prioritisation that it gives to cancer services and cancer care and the cancer research programme. We opened a new state-of-the-art research building in 2007. We've had enormous support from the from the organisation in having access to recruit new chair positions, new academic leads in various areas that are essential to providing the framework for precision cancer medicine, the human capital that's going to deliver that. But like anything else in these times, we cannot rely solely on the university. The university is under financial pressures, as you all know. I think the university has been a champion, a leader, and has really brought this to the fore as a result of its investment and prioritisation of cancer. I think it needs to be supported and continue to be supported in order to see this through and see the generation, because actually the academic centre is the heart of this. It's the cluster, it's the area that's going to bring forward the innovations linked with companies so that the companies then can prosecute. Academic organisations are great in terms of doing the discovery, acquiring new knowledge. It's the industry piece that helps deliver that knowledge into the asset that then can be tailored into patient care. So the university is the lifeblood. It cannot be cut off from this. It must be an integral part of this.
Okay, finally, how helpful has InvestNI been in relation to getting new funding and new leads for your project, and Connected Health Initiative? Are you aware of the Connected Health?
I am aware of the Connected Health Initiative. It's been probably less of an impact on the cancer services per se. I will only speak in positive light of terms of the support that I have received from the life science sector from Invest Northern Ireland. They have, in their own way, seen the importance of what we're trying to achieve. They've invested in the academic industrial partnerships that we have fostered with ALMAC. Other colleagues in the respiratory medicine programme are working actively with Randox in those regards, with Invest Northern Ireland, and as we speak, Invest Northern Ireland have several proposals on the table from companies that we have spoken to at bio conferences. So I think they've done a commendable job. Again, I would caution that cuts to the Invest Northern Ireland budget will not be helpful in trying to grow the life science sector. It is a very valuable way of enticing other companies to relocate here. The key is that once they've relocated, we use the expertise in a very strategic fashion to actually then leverage more funding from the European community. So I would argue that all of these entities, the academic sector with Queen's University, the Belfast Trust and the Department of Health, and all of these companies and Invest Northern Ireland play a vital part in getting everybody together to build this sector. And this sector will not grow if one of those entities is in any way compromised. So they must all be supported.
Great. Thanks very much, David.
Thanks,
Chair.
Mr. Agnew, Stephen.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, David, for the information so far. I suppose you mentioned the magic formula of industry, government and university kind of working collaboratively. Obviously, it's a very difficult time to ask for additional resources from government, and you mentioned particularly the challenges for Dell. What about the industry input into infrastructure? Do they contribute in that regard?
Yeah, we've embedded 2 companies within our building, for example, and they have contributed to the programmes in their own way. They have contributed to elements of estate and infrastructure. And that's part of the terms and conditions of the investment that they receive, the support that they receive from the university and also from Invest Northern Ireland. So, yes, industry does contribute. But at the same time, I think the onus here is in all parties getting round the table to secure the sums that are required. I do believe that infrastructure is essential for Northern Ireland to be competitive in so many different fronts, and it's really about how government prioritises where it wants to invest, in order that it has the infrastructure to be internationally competitive. We can't be good at everything. We have to be good at some things. You've already invested in life sciences. Now we've got to an evolution point where we need more infrastructure to actually deliver on the promises and the evidence that has been attained through phase 1 investment and prioritisation of this sector.
I'm just wondering, strategically, I mean, obviously it's a very competitive global industry. You've also got some of the biggest companies in the world, certainly GlaxoSmithKline. I remember back when I was doing business studies, we're always top of the kind of charts in terms of profitable companies around the world. Mm-hmm. If we ask more for industry, do we risk losing industry? Or once they're here, do they commit, and can we ask for more?
So, yeah, I think this is, again, getting to the point of what you need to have is the infrastructure that industry look at and say, yeah, we've got to be a part of that. Mm-hmm. Currently, we have an element of the infrastructure, but it's not at a sustainable capacity that's going to excite the large pharmaceutical companies of the world to come and say, we've got to base all of our clinical trial activity in Northern Ireland. They want to work with us closer. I think that was the message, simply because of the evidence that they had seen that the centre, working in partnership with Indigenous companies, had actually taken this pipeline all the way through. And the fact that we do have a patient population which is crying out for increased clinical trial activity, I think it's something that becomes attractive for them. But what you need to have is the infrastructure to deliver clinical trials on a scale that we currently do not have.
So it's really, we need to put in the investment first, and then industry will follow.
They will come, and that is the key message. It is about actually having something that you can walk them around, show them, and say, so here's what our Indigenous companies are already doing in early phase clinical trials. Here's how we're already working with several elements of your peer group in the multinational pharmaceutical industry, and we are doing that, but I think we can increase the capacity so much more. And as I say, it's about how you bring that footprint on to us, but at the same time taking the assets that they bring and using it for the health and the societal well-being of patients and Northern Ireland in general.
Going the slightly different track, well, a very different track, use of animal testing. I suppose, how prevalent is that, and what investment has been put into innovations to move us away from animal testing?
So this is a really important issue in the life science sector, and I'm of the opinion that animal research is an essential element of translating academic discovery from a laboratory through into patient care. You're absolutely right. We have to start to look at alternative replacement models, and the life science community is wholly committed to doing that. And where we have tried to build, for example, instead of using xenografted models on nude mice in laboratory colonies, we're starting to use patient-derived xenograft models. where we can actually take patient material which is more representative of the patient's tumour and actually using it on a mouse model. Now, you may say it's not reducing use of animals in research, but it's actually making the research models that we use more closely aligned and of greater value to patient care. Unfortunately, at this point, the life science community has not come up with alternative strategies that enable you to translate discovery into patient care without going through preclinical models. All of our safety, all of our drug toxicology has to be done in those living models.
How much is about the needs of science and how much is legislation? And not that I mean, I certainly receive examples of whereby there are repeated trials, etc., whereby, to me, as I suppose a layman in terms of this subject, it seems unnecessary repetition of trials. It may not be specific to cancer, some of the examples I'm thinking of, but you know, how much are you being required to do tests that, I suppose, from a researcher, you feel is unnecessary, or can you say every trial that you can conduct it?
I take the point. I can only speak on behalf of the research team that I represent in the Centre for Cancer Research and Cell Biology and those within the School of Medicine at Queen's University. No researcher actively desires to wish to pursue research on animals.
I'm specifically asking, are you required because of legislation yet?
But if you ask us in terms of do we do due diligence in seeing if the experiment that we wish to perform has been conducted elsewhere before we start, absolutely. We are compelled to do so by the law, and we abide by that. And if we are trying to do something completely innovative, then we use all of the legislation and the guidelines to reduce, refine and reuse so that we reduce the burden of numbers of animals that we employ in those experiments. Unfortunately, if you want to progress anything into patient care, these are the steps that you, or indeed other organisations, must take. Now, what we have tried to do is take an absolutely compassionate role, but the essential legislative role of how we need to progress translational research at Queen's. And
finally, just on this issue, how much, I suppose, protection is there of kind of intellectual property rights when it comes to medical research? So you said doing the due diligence. Can you get access to other research? Is there a time limit on before that research is published, or how open, I suppose, is access to such research?
So again, intellectual property acquisition and protection is absolutely integral to the vision that I've talked about today, because without it you will not actually see the commercialisation agenda or indeed the industry or company engagement. In the partnerships that we've developed between Queen's and Almac, for example, we have very rigid and very robust intellectual property registers so that we can actually follow the prosecution, the delivery of and the acquisition of the intellectual property, how it's been prosecuted, and then that in its own right becomes part of the due diligence process that any company from outside wanting to avail of Almac products and Queen's products would actually go through. So all of that has to be secured, because we're acutely aware that that's where the commercial value of any product will come from and stem from. And as I say, the way in which we've achieved this is reminiscent of the way in which Almac in its own right have been able to commercialise some of the elements coming from their pipeline. So it's absolutely...
In that regard, that protection, I understand from, I suppose, the business side of it, why it's almost essential to protect your intellectual property rights.
Yep.
But is that meaning then that research on animals is being repeated in different labs across the world because the evidence coming out of that research is not being shared?
No. I think the pressure again is on academia to always push publication of results. And so again, I believe that if data is available, having been pushed across animal models, then it will ultimately be published. And when it's published, then we become acutely aware of it again. Also, when patents are published, then you have access to going in and understanding what has been achieved, what is being protected, and what is the evidence for that protection. So if animal experiments have been used in patent protection and intellectual property protection and filings, then again we have access to that.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Okay. Mr. Humphreys, William.
Thanks, Chair. Thank you very much for your evidence and your presentation today. I think the work clearly that you're involved in, David, is absolutely invaluable because, excuse me, every home is touched by it and every family impacted by it. And so therefore, particularly in Northern Ireland, I think we know how important this work is. Can I ask you then, in terms of the evidence you gave, you said that we need political leadership around the issue. Can I ask you what that political leadership looks like from your perspective?
I think it's cross-party support. I'm not saying that it's one or two individuals. I believe it's about actually using the executive as a vehicle for delivering essential infrastructure that I believe is vital to our health of a vast majority of our population and the well-being of our population. And that to me is delivered across all parties, and I think, as Mr. McKinney raised, also the fact that it stems across a majority of government departments. And I think it's connected. We've talked about connected health. I think it's about connected government being able to deliver on this issue.
Well, following on from that, key to your work would be, and the vision that you have, which I commend absolutely, would be academia, business and government, DETI, DEL and Department of Health working together. In your experience,
education as well.
Yeah, okay. How good are we at doing that in Northern Ireland, and have we improved?
So, as I said, I see developments, positive developments in all areas, but I cannot again say that I have evidence that various government departments are talking to one another in terms of actually coming forward with an integrated plan. I may be wrong on that, don't quote me, but I think these are the things that I would love to see. I would love to bring members from my own centre, academic leads in various disciplines, together with industry leads and together with the various government departments, and sit down and work through a forum of how you would actually deliver this vision. I can only say that you probably have closer knowledge of whether government departments are working together to achieve these types of major enterprises and activities.
It just seems to me that you mentioned Randox and Almac and I remember doing business with Galen before it was Almac.
Yes, indeed.
But in terms of going forward, especially, and you mentioned the cuts and the economic climate in which we operate, getting the joined-upness of government and the departments that we've mentioned, companies like Almac and Randox and academia to work together, especially when money is tight, is absolutely essential.
Yes.
I detect from what you've said, we are in a better place. We're not in the place you would want us to be, and I think that's probably the view of everyone around the table.
Yes.
Is there some way, have you put forward suggestions, is there some way that we can get to, do we need a czar to do this or something? Champion it?
Well, sometimes a small committee is more effective in terms of being able to deliver a vision. Sometimes wider committees and trying to get consensus across too many people is difficult. But I think if you were able to identify key leads within each of those key sectors, 2 or 3 from health, 2 or 3 from industry, 2 or 3 from the academic sector, then I believe you can actually come forward with a vision that actually enables a delivery of this type of vision. I think it's achievable. I think we have to make this achievable. I think there are things that we can use this for that go beyond just the cancer programme, but actually providing a true evidence-based example of how you do innovate in Northern Ireland, how you do use all of the commendable individual sectors and bring them together to actually achieve some very, very meaningful outputs. You know, I spent 10 years living in the US. It was a transformative period of my life, but one of the key things that I learned is that Americans are great at selling good news stories. We need good news stories to get out there. And then we have the ability to sell something and show that this country can do some major and very globally impacting activities.
Thanks for your reply and good luck with all your...
Thank you. Thanks.
Okay. Professor Wall, that concludes this session with yourself, and thank you very, very much indeed for your time. And just so that you know from here onwards, and picking up on what William said there, well, what do we do about this? Just to seek the agreement of members that we have a retrospective Hansard of this session in particular, and then the committee will look through various items and various issues that have been raised, and then, if you like, produce action column, a list of stuff that we should have responsibility for advancing, and maybe other committees in the Assembly to add that bit of joined upness that William was talking about there. So thanks very much indeed for your time.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you all for your time this morning. And I would welcome you all to come and visit the Centre for Cancer Research and Cell Biology in 2015. I would love to open the opportunity for you to have one of your committee meetings there and to learn firsthand of some of the other really significant work that we're doing.
I think that will be very useful, and thank you for that invite too.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Right. Members, on that very point, I think we should agree to go and visit the centre at some stage.
And I just think it's important also to say that, you know, that what David has outlined is the continuance of a vision already started, and I think it's worthwhile also evaluating. And just on the San Diego experience, and Gordon will be able to vouch for this, that given their early decisions that they made in San Diego around this sort of stuff, against threats to their other income, they turned that into a £5 billion a year business, dollars a year business. So the evidence is out there that this type of thing can work.
Yeah, could we just ask members to either put their phones on silent or remove them if they must use them, remove them way back from the microphones, please, because there's some interference coming across. You probably heard it there. And the next session is going to be Hansarded, so we need to make sure we get this bit properly recorded. Okay, so thank you for that. We'll now move to the next item on the agenda, which is the oral briefing on the Insolvency Amendment Bill. And to inform members on this, we have the clerk's brief, which we've already gone through in the earlier part at page 4 of the table papers onwards, and the consultation responses from Insolvency Technical Committee of the Institute of Chartered Accountants in Ireland is at page 19, from Kevin Kelly at page 21, from PricewaterhouseCoopers at page 8 of the table papers, and from Step Change Debt Charity at page 41. And with us here today we have Mr. Sean Kavanagh, the chairperson of the Insolvency Technical Committee of the Institute of Chartered Accountants in Ireland and partner in Kavanagh Kelly, Mr. Stephen Cave, a partner in PricewaterhouseCoopers and a member of the Insolvency Technical Committee of the Institute of Chartered Accountants in Ireland, and Mr. Gareth Latimer, Senior Manager of the Business Recovery Services in PricewaterhouseCoopers. Thanks very much in coming today and being with us here. You're very welcome indeed, and we look forward to hearing from you and indeed pursuing and maybe drilling down a wee bit deeper into some of the issues that you've raised in your submission. Now, the committee already has received your detailed submission, so members have read what you've had to say. So, but initially, I don't know who's fronting on this particular. It's yourself, right? That's grand. Then, so you have the opportunity to make your opening statement, and then we have the question and answer session from members. So, if you're happy enough to go with that, please go ahead.
Yes, indeed, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. I just want to briefly introduce myself, very briefly. I'm a partner in Kavanagh Kelly. We are a firm of insolvency practitioners and chartered accountants, and I lead up our insolvency department. We have 5 offices, and we really welcome the opportunity here today to. Can I just let the committee know as well that I also chair the, as the chairman has advised there, I also chair the ITC, which is the Insolvency Technical Committee of the Institute of Chartered Accountants in Belfast, and that represents all the members in Northern Ireland. We do welcome the opportunity to be here this morning with you, and I don't intend going through all 14 clauses. Suffice to say that we welcome all virtually all of the submissions, all of the legislation, bar one item, one section, section 14. There are some sections concerning the objectives that I'll just say we particularly welcome. The clauses concerning, for example, modernisation of communication methods, which I think you have all debated and are well known and well outlined. The other one was on meetings. And the third one I welcome particularly is the facilitating of banks to provide bank accounts for bankrupts, which again I understand was the subject of quite a bit of debate. The one clause we have issue with, and that is clause 14, which is really concerning the partial authorisation of insolvency practitioners. And our difficulty with that is that we don't see this in the public interest. We see this as causing greater cost to the taxpayer, to the public at large, because if these provisions go through, the regulatory bodies will have to incur greater costs of monitoring, setting up systems for monitoring. That in turn will be passed on to insolvency practitioners through their fees, and that in turn will be less dividend to the general public. So we have a problem with that. On a technical side, we also have a problem in that we, in Northern Ireland, firstly, we don't see there be a great appetite for this. In our practice, we work across both corporate and personal insolvency. A lot of individuals who come to us, we are not clear, it isn't clear to them even, whether the solution to their bankruptcy, to their insolvency issues will be following a personal route or a corporate route. Some people will have been directors of companies. We only find that out later on. Some people may well have been a partner in some particular business or other. And therefore, in our opinion, if this bill goes through and if this clause goes through the way it is, there will be situations where partial authorisation, say for example if someone's only authorised to take personal work, they will find that there is corporate work, they will find that they will not be able to take the case, basically. And we really see there is a problem here. There is a great, what we call, and the word has been used, I think, in the submissions up to now, overlap between personal and corporate work. And that is our particular problem with this item of legislation. And I'll be happy to give firm examples of that in practice, which we have had to deal with in our everyday work. The final thing that really I would raise with the committee, and that is that the GB legislation, which of course was kicking off in 2010 and then later 2012, this particular clause on partial authorisation has not, as of yet, been enacted, and I understand it will be enacted sometime in 2015. But it is interesting that even in GB, there was no strong case made for the enactment of that legislation, and therefore when we looked to see could we find some items which would help us to support this committee and make a compelling case for its adoption, we couldn't find any. So we're struggling both from the point of view of our personal experience and our practice in County Kelly, and we're struggling from the point of view of looking for external evidence of why this is necessary. And my final point will be that we think that this is designed maybe for what we would call the consumer debt category of activity. And the consumer debt category of activity, I understand now, is really not. It doesn't involve us. It doesn't a lot of RPBs, that is professional bodies, professional regulatory bodies. So we don't know, and I think that's going to be regulated separately as well in GB. So we could be dealing with a different kind of scenario. Therefore, as far as we go, as far as we can see the situation in Northern Ireland, we do not see there going to be any big appetite or any great interest in this. And those are the three main points at which we have a problem. But apart from that, one Clause 14, we are very, very supportive of the rest of the legislation. So there's a lot of positivity coming out of this.
Right. Thanks very much, Mr. Kavanagh. And just like I know from my own personal experience of the professionalism of your firm, so there's no doubt in that. Just to get back to this partial licensing thing, and we've put it to it, so we're kind of in the realms of hypothesis. You don't know how it works. Over in England, they don't know how it works yet because it's not in. But we put it to the department what the driver was for us, and I'll read you out to what the department said here. You may be aware of it. But anyway, the department informed the committee that it is obliged to follow what has been done in England in order to comply with the EU Services Directive. Under the conditions for granting of authorisation, the directive states at Article 10.4, and this is a quote direct from the article, the authorisation shall establish the provider to have access to the service activity or to exercise that activity throughout the national territory, which, without getting into politics, in this instance is coming from Westminster, including by means of setting up agencies, subsidiaries, branches or offices, except where an authorisation for each individual establishment or limitation of the authorisation to a certain part of the territory is justified by an overriding reason relating to the public interest. So that's the legislation that they have cited. That's the reason why they have said it's been brought in over in Britain. And so really, unless, basically back over to you, unless there's an overriding reason relating to the public interest, I don't know of it.
Stephen, certainly I have points to make on that, but Stephen is happy to take that point on board. Stephen Cave.
Yes,
Mr. Chairman, and just to comment on, I think it is, we have discussed this at length within both the Insolvency Technical Committee and indeed within the profession generally, and whilst I think there could be safeguards to the extent that this does be brought in, and we're supportive of everything else in relation to it, there could be safeguards put in place. Fundamentally, I think it is a matter of public interest because it often, particularly given our economy over here and the existence of the small SME businesses, quite often when an individual is sitting in...
Bear in mind, this is an overriding reason relating to the public interest. Now, you're going to have SMEs in Britain, you're going to have them in Scotland, England, Wales. So I'm thinking there it would need to be quite exceptional. And Stephen, you're a man that's well practiced in this stuff yourself. You know what I'm talking about.
I think it's a fair point, but the issue is in terms of providing the right advice to the business at hand, and the difficulty is that if you're purely licensed to practice personal insolvency and the person is sitting in front of you, often do not know in that first interaction or first several interactions in terms of whether that is down a personal insolvency line or whether that is down a corporate, or often a mix of the two. However, I do take the point, Mr. Chair.
Well, Timmy, there's one issue that cropped up. If this isn't going to apply in a lot of cases, why be worried about it?
I think I would agree with that, Mr. Chairman. I would agree that this is not going to apply in a lot of cases. But at the same time, the RPVs, if the legislation comes in, the RPVs will be obliged to provide the framework for dealing with requests for partial authorisation. That then will mean there is cost, and that cost will be passed on to the consumer. We do have my understanding is that a lot of legislation, as it outworks through GB, a lot of the consideration is the amount of savings that will be achieved by, and that's part, in my opinion, of part of the public interest.
Well,
I could be wrong, but
well, an overriding reason. It's back to that now, and just. That's the reason that the department has given to us, and I'm seeking to tease out. Now, if I'm sort of trying to pick up here, if, as I think maybe in your own evidence, you said that there's not going to be that many cases where this will apply, then I'm just back to, and you're the accountant, I'm just back to, if there's not going to be that many reasons where it's going to apply, well, then there's not going to be an awful lot of money involved in monitoring it.
no, but there will be money involved in setting up the procedures for monitoring. That's where the expense will be. My understanding was that in the earlier consultation there was a figure of 2,500 or something that CARB, which is our regulatory body for the Institute of Chartered Accountants. Now, with respect to the committee, 2,500 will not establish the requisite monitoring systems to set that up. So, but I do take your point, Mr. Chairman, that if there isn't a big take-up, the monitoring at the same time, even if you only have 3 or 4, there will have to be some system set up, and indeed it will require in some cases perhaps dual visits by RPBs to firms like ourselves, for example. If we had partial licensee, then someone's going to have to come to regulate that, and to regulate the cases taken on. It's going to be complicated. So you will have them coming on there. As you know, the regulatory bodies all regulate all the insolvency firms in Northern Ireland.
But this is my point. If your argument is that it's going to apply in a limited number of cases or a few cases,
yes,
then it's going to be, by logic, it's going to be complicated, but for a few cases. And you've dealt with, you're all seasoned practitioners, you've dealt with the multiplicity of complexities around these things. That's why you're here today. I'm just trying to get where exactly the consistency of the argument's coming from. If it's going to be complex, it's going to be for a few cases. So it's not going to be a huge magnitude of stuff that's coming your direction.
No. Being frank and being honest about it, we've debated this in our practice, and Stephen and I have debated this as well. We are conscious of the fact that the word you use there, Mr. Chairman, is an overriding interest. If in fact human rights legislation, and if in fact the desire to follow the legislation as it outworks in GB has to be followed, reluctantly we would have to concede that extra dimension of overriding that requirement is difficult to defeat. It is difficult to. So I am conscious, and I do understand the views you're making, Mr. Chairman. But it is interesting that in GB, as I alluded to earlier, we couldn't see any. There was nothing in the consultation. There was nothing in the submissions by ICAEW, which is the institute or indeed Scotland, ICAS in Scotland. There was nothing there that indicated that they could find in favour of it. So,
no, I appreciate that, but it's back to that. If they're, and this is the department, I'm trying to be devil's advocate here. Yeah. They're citing EU legislation and EU directives here, services directive.
Of course.
So obviously, like so many of these, read across and compliance is almost a given. So, but anyway, I want to just could you just, I want to ask you just to tease it out a bit further. You've said, and again we're into the realms of hypothesis, but your hypothesis with the experienced seasoned hat of what you do. You said that partial authorisation would have a detrimental impact on the quality of advice and on the prospects for recovering money from debtors, or creditors rather. Could you, in that realm of what might happen, could you give us an indication as to how you see that creating difficulties in that area?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. At a practical level, we will come in when we are, for example, doing IVAs, voluntary arrangements, and we will find that you have, for example, perhaps a husband and wife, you have a debtor situation, you will have a person who owes money, for example, in relation to either a personal guarantee or in relation to a debt that was incurred while they were a director or while they were where they're in their guise as a director of some company. Now, when you're actually dealing with that at the coalface, the partially licensed person who is licensed only to carry out personal work has to say to that debtor, I can't act for you. You have to take someone who is experienced in corporate work,
yes,
who understands what are directors, what are the concerns, what are the company issues concerning directors, or more particularly, what are the issues, the corporate issues surrounding personal guarantees. And that is an actual coal-face practical point where there will be situations where we have to say to them, as that happens and as that obtains at the moment, being duly qualified means that we can actually deal with those cases there and then, deal with it seamlessly and have no issue. And that debtor is not disadvantaged in any one way, whereas if it's someone who's only personally licensed, they are not going to be aware of the company, of the ramifications of directors, what that means for DDU, what that means for so many other parts of legislation. So the debtor, in that instance, in our opinion, could be disadvantaged.
Well, just can I throw an analogy? One where someone requires, we'll say, could be specialist advice in marital law and specialist advice in licensing law, we'll say, just to pluck an example out of the air. You go to the one who does that, you go to the one who does that, and that doesn't really present a difference or a problem to people.
I think the two analogies are not just exactly comparable. I think the issue of, we call this the overlap. For example, marital law and licensing law would be more distinct, in my opinion.
Sorry, I'm just pulling that out of the air there. But if you want things done, you go to somebody who knows what they're doing, right? And that's, in your case, your argument is, well, we can handle it all here. But what problem is it if you come along to someone, you discuss the case with them? I'm trying to get to the bottom of this, and they say, well, I only deal with corporate issues. You have to go to somebody to deal with your personal matters there around that. And that's grand. It could be even within a small company. They could say, I don't deal with that, but he deals with it or she deals with it. What's wrong with that?
I can only answer that by saying that at the coalface in our practice, and indeed our practice would be representative of a lot of the insolvency work that's carried out in Northern Ireland, there still are very many situations where there is this, and forgive me for using the word again, overlap of of disciplines, where the personal and the corporate, people coming in with debt, looking for debt advice, there can often be situations where indeed maybe we would advise them, if we're doing an IVA, to actually go down certain corporate routes occasionally, or can they actually form a limited company, for example? And the personal person is going to say, I can't answer that question.
Well, can I maybe just piece it out a stage further, because I'm sort of I'm getting a bit of a picture here at the moment. Say, for example, it could be, say you and me, I'm partially authorised, you're partially authorised, but we have a working arrangement. I do corporate, you do personal, or whatever it might be. And somebody comes along to me and say, no, well, sorry, I don't do personal, but Sean's good at it. And you have a working arrangement. What's wrong with that?
In theory, there would be nothing wrong with that, except that, again, you're adding another layer of cost, because the person who's the corporate specialist is going to have to come in. So instead of dealing with one person who has both disciplines within his academic armoury, he is able to handle that question there and then, and deal with it. Whereas in the situation that you've just outlined, then we're going to have to bring another person in. So you're adding another layer of cost onto the particular exercise.
Mr. Chairman, if I could just perhaps add that, I think the position that's being outlined is not an insurmountable one in terms of actually the practical logistical arrangements to deal with those type of situations, as to your point. I think that the reality in whatever analogies we pull is often within an initial 1-hour consultation with
Yes.
a business in financial distress, you're often crossing back and forth across those areas many times.
Yes.
So I don't think it's insurmountable in terms of practical arrangements to deal with that, but I do think it presents practical issues.
Well, I'll just maybe, since you're taking me there, and I was going to come to this. So, therefore, I presume within your firm you have people who specialise in corporate and the others who specialise in personal.
Yes.
Not everybody's an expert in everything.
Yes, that's correct. And there are occasions in terms of,
Yes.
of that where you will refer to, well, this particular person specialises in personal bankruptcy.
Yes.
Whether they are actually a licensed insolvency practitioner
Yes.
in that area or not, and where you can bring in the relevant disciplines. Per your analogy, there may be tax situations, you need to bring in a tax person, and you call on those specialists as and when needed. The issue is, or the concern perhaps, as opposed to the issue that we're alluding to, is the bringing that together to make sure whoever, so in the analogy, if you're sitting at the far side of the table, often in a distress situation in this, because perhaps you've run out of cash, you need advice in order to quickly and efficiently deal with that across that spectrum. I suppose that is the concern, but I do not believe it. We do not believe it's an insurmountable one, to take on the point.
No, I'm just sort of looking at here. Surely the market, like, you're good at what you do. That's why you are, and what you do, where you do it. But surely the market will determine if somebody's pretty poor or pretty shabby at their job. Well, they're not going to go to them, even if there are, as you say, limited number of cases where these partial licences will be issued or operable. I'm just trying to get to what the nub of the issue is.
I think that's a very fair point indeed, and we operate in a market-related and a market-dictated environment. There's no question about that. The only fear we would have is that if a debtor comes for advice and there is some element of the solution to their problems lies in having some knowledge of corporate law, and then that debtor, as I've indicated earlier, is going to be slightly disadvantaged. And that won't necessarily, the debtor sadly won't be aware, unless they find out maybe later that they have actually, maybe there were other options which, had they been able to consider, could have left themselves in a better position.
Okay, right, thanks. Okay, now, PwC, you raised an issue about grandfathering. Can you elaborate a wee bit more on that, as to what way that operates? What's that concept for me, please? Just.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Going back some 20 years plus before the introduction of formal examinations across a range of disciplines in order to become a licensed insolvency practitioner and able to take formal appointments, there was a system whereby, provided your experience record was signed off in that regard, you did not have to formally sit exams, so you were grandfathered in to that system. And whilst there are a mix of practitioners still in the market in terms of those that have sat, such as myself, the formal examinations to become qualified in that, and those that were grandfathered in, the point is that we have absolutely no issue with people that were grandfathered in and still continue to practice in that space, and that has been, excuse the expression, but their day job.
Right.
As against those that were perhaps out of the market for quite some time, doing many varied and totally diverse things, and then post the recession that hopefully we're now out of, have effectively then reapplied to get their licence back. And it seems, on one hand, whilst we have a debate about authorisation and people having to go through and achieve a relevant competency, that does not sit right within that framework.
Okay. And would there be many insolvency practitioners who have actually qualified in that way?
That are still in practice, Mr. Chairman?
That have inherited that role, or?
Through that, it is probably a handful.
Okay.
It's no more than that.
Oh, grand. That's okay. Thanks very much for that. Mr. Frew, Paul.
Yeah, thank you. I suppose my questions relate to PwC more than any of the other contributors here today, and that's around the clause 1, the fact with regards to the single physical location and being able to modernise it, if you like, and use technology in order to get a forum or a meeting in place whereby all the creditors and all the players in it can hear and communicate with each other, albeit not even in the same room. With regards to the PwC response, you talk about sorts of problems that could arise as a result of roles not being sufficiently prescriptive. To use your terms, you talk about a statement of insolvency practice, SIPs.
Yes.
Can you give us some detail of what you actually mean there? What do you see as being something that would be fit for purpose?
Okay, so just to clarify the point, Mr. Frew, firstly I would state we're hugely supportive as a whole of modernising, to use your term, which I think is a good one, in terms of modernising the approach and ultimately trying to make this more efficient and indeed more cost effective for creditors in situations. The points of concern in there were just again around practical application, around how, for instance, so how do you deal with a situation where somebody said, my link to get into that meeting did not work? How do you verify that Mr. Frew, who is purported to be a creditor of this business, is actually Mr. Frew on the other end of the phone, the video conference or whatever? So again, I think it's a layer beneath, hence why we referred to the statements of insolvency practice, which are all often sit as best practice standards beneath the legislation to make sure there's consistency of approach around how a particular practitioner and their firm implements that.
Yes. I take the point you make with the difficulties there. Technology fails from time to time, and you're about to have a very, very important meeting and something goes wrong. Is there any way that you can guard against it? This seems to be a very good idea and the way forward, but
yes.
Is there any way that you know of that you get around that problem? And then, if you do have items that will resolve this issue and take away the concern, how do you put that on a face of a bill?
It's a fair point. I think because we haven't got into that space as yet, there's an element of that will need to evolve. There needs to be consistency of how practices approach that, because one particular firm's systems and how they deal with that may be totally different to another, and it's about how you bring consistency of approach so as the creditor sees that. I think it can all be managed and dealt with, and in some ways, to use an analogy, it's no different to, well, somebody was stuck in traffic and didn't make the meeting that was supposed to be attending the meeting. You have the option to adjourn the meeting. So similar type principles, I think, can be adopted in practice to deal with that, because it would be hugely beneficial to moving things forward in the modern age.
Can I just say an analogy? Sorry, just an analogy of that is that nowadays, with meetings held, for example, at a lot of what I call very high-end auctions, if you have someone in Malta or someone in Venezuela or someone in Australia, you have to be absolutely certain you're dealing with maybe several £100 million. Yes. There is a mechanism there for making sure that the guy on the other end of that phone is who he says he is. Otherwise, you're out a lot of money. So I would envisage that technology will go down that route of ensuring that there is a password, that there is a password yes. for each particular case, and that will be unique to the particular case in question.
Okay, yeah, I understand. And that brings with it the security then of making sure that all the characters...
Password-orientated security will end up solving that, in my opinion.
With regards to technology, it's vitally important that everyone at that meeting, whether they're there or remotely there, will have to hear and communicate with everyone.
Yes.
Well, a phone call surely won't cut it. Surely it will need to be more advanced technology.
Well, I think both Stephen and ourselves, we use video conferencing for a lot of our ordinary corporate meetings quite a lot now.
Yes.
And I'm sure all members will be aware that that has come on a long, long way. And I just finished a case last week with a client in India, in Bangalore. There's yes. no problem whatsoever with overcoming all the normal difficulties, and I think that's with us today. That's why we welcome this legislation.
There is an issue also raised in PwC's report around the amount of time needed to sort out the logistics, hire a venue, or identify a venue and inform the creditors then of the venue. And you talk about sufficient time. In your eyes, what is sufficient time to organise that? I know it's logistics, but it's just so that we get it right.
I think, Mr. Frew, it will vary from case to case depending on the spread of your creditors. So again, to follow on from John's analogy, in the situation where you have a lot of foreign creditors, perhaps different time zones, etc., that will require more logistical planning. Typically within our world, that's a minimum of 2 weeks in terms of how the existing legislation, it will range from 2 to 4 weeks of notice period for any given meeting. And I think, within those similar timeframes is more than sufficient to do what is needed. I think what we need to make sure in the practical implementation of this is that it is consistently applied, and hence the reference to perhaps a statement of insolvency practice around it. And indeed, and without doing my own firm an injustice, in order to make sure that the small one-person practitioner firm is not being ousted, for want of a better phrase, from the market because they feel, well, we cannot make that investment in the technology piece. So it's how to get something that moves it all forward, but by the same token continues with the competitive and proper landscape that is there for the insolvency practitioners.
Yes. Is this open to abuse with regards to delaying?
I think it's potentially, like anything, is open to abuse across the piece in terms of, we all see in terms of cybercrime, in terms of use of technology. So there is an element of evolving in terms of that, and us all needing to, I suppose, to the extent that that comes in, stay close to the situation of how is it working, and then adopt. But as opposed to having to change legislation, the legislation should provide the framework umbrella, and then within that, for instance, statements of insolvency practice and guidelines can then be tweaked as needs be as it goes to try to eliminate any such activities.
Just a very practical point on that, Mr. You're absolutely correct in your observation. The issue, for example, of electronically transferring dividend payments, this is now down to the coalface, and you hit a wrong number or whatever, and the legislation, the banking legislation, is going to have to actually come into the modern world to cope with it like that, where there is an issue of some fraudulent payment, or a payment is made even just by a simple clerical error.
Yes.
So we are entering into a completely new world, and some of us are already there in relation to. Essentially, a lot of us are just going to have to be a lot more careful.
Okay. I want to change tack now to talk about the regulation, or the lack of regulation, with regards to insolvency practitioners. If I was to say that we should have on this bill more effective supervision, maybe even regulation of insolvency practitioners, what would you say about that? Okay,
maybe I can take that, Mr. Frew, because wearing my hat as chair of ITC, the Insolvency Technical Committee, I work closely with CARB, who are the regulatory body for the Institute of Chartered Accountants in Ireland, and I work very closely as well with bodies across the water. And I would submit to the committee that the insolvency profession is one of the most, and I think this is accepted, it's not just my observation, is one of the most highly regulated in the world, and I mean in the world. The OECD data has come out and found that in the UK, the insolvency profession is the 6th best. Now, don't ask me where we got and who the other 5 are, please. But they are the 6th best.
They're not partially licensed.
Maybe so. But there is a very strict monitoring regime, and that regime, I would submit here today, is extremely robust. It's regulated highly by an ethics committee. There is a very highly regulated, and all IPs, all insolvency practitioners, have to actually sign up, and on the monitoring visits, their compliance with strict ethical guidelines, and those ethical guidelines are monitored every year. So I could literally take a half an hour and going through it in detail and bore you to tears in the details of where we are. And I would also submit that, for example, we have moved on in the modern world, that our committee, if there are any problems, if there are any shortcomings in the quality of advice that emerges from the monitoring reports, that's actually published. It's actually published in the public domain. So any people inside our profession who fall short of certain standards, believe you me, they're brought to book. And I am pleased to see that government does recognise that generally in its reports. Government has found that the RPBs, because the Insolvency Service, and I should say this, the Insolvency Service is the overarching body which monitors the monitoring bodies. So the monitoring bodies, you have the IPs having the monitoring bodies, the regulatory, the RPBs as I call them, and then on top of that, there's a layer on top of that called, which is the Insolvency Service, which is obviously government, monitors, and those are not just paper exercises, those are actual visits where in England and also in Northern Ireland, the Insolvency Service carries out monitoring of the RPBs.
And I take your point, and you have every right to defend your profession. There's absolutely no problem with that, and I take what you say with regards to you can spend half an hour on it. But yet, with all of that, there are still, we hear still cases of people being oppressive and unfair to clients, assets of a business being used to pay money to people who weren't even creditors. Now, if it is heavily regulated, as you suggest, how can things like this still happen and no penalty be incurred on to the actual practitioner?
I am aware of a reference to that, and perhaps, Mr. Brew, you are referring to something that was discussed apparently at one of these previous meetings. I understand, and I didn't check this out now, but I understand that the person concerned was not a part, or certainly of the RPBs that I would be directly concerned with. Now, clearly, that person had to be authorised somewhere in the process, so I'm not for one moment minimising the comment or trying to just literally brush it under the carpet. But so therefore, I cannot obviously make any comment in relation to that particular case.
No, I understand.
But I would submit to the committee that really there's always a chance. I don't think there's any system that's ever perfect. And it would be remiss of me today to say that on the monitoring visits, some members do fall short. But can I also say, and it's a point that Stephen made, in addition, we have now started in the last few years a system called SIPs, which you alluded to earlier on, Statements of Insolvency Practice. Now, those SIPs they're more than just persuasive. They are actually guidelines that all of our members have to play. And we have actually brought, I think there are 17 at the moment in place. And all 17, it means that we cover nearly every aspect of work. And that's why I could go down into the level of detail. And all of our members on the monitoring visits, all of their compliance with those SIPs, those Statements of Accounting Practice, have to be adhered to. That doesn't take away from the fact that you're alluding to one case where obviously those standards weren't applied.
Would you support a statutory provision for a code of conduct in respect to insolvency practitioners and or even a continual professional development programme?
That's already in place. We already have a CPD programme. We are already there, Mr. Brew. Mr. Chairman, we have a certain number of hours, very, very strictly regulated. I am talking about the RPB, of which myself and Stephen are part of. Clearly, there are 7 RPBs. You maybe this committee isn't aware there are 7 RPBs. And I, for one, I agree with you. I'd be one for an absolute level playing field across all RPBs, which maybe is taking
Can I just as a statutory provision for one? Now,
well, it's heading that way.
You have an internal one. I'm well aware of that within your profession. Statutory provision enshrined in law.
I wouldn't have a problem with that. I would submit, Mr. Chairman, that really and truly the monitoring of our bodies is so strict at the moment that if that became statutory, it wouldn't cause a problem.
Right, okay. Thanks for that. Thank you. Mr. Dunn, Gordon.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks very much, gentlemen. I'll be brief because you've been here for some time. Clause 3 talks about the removal of the requirement for annual meetings in relation to voluntary liquidation creditors. Voluntary liquidation.
Yes.
What's your opinion on that?
Okay, Stephen.
Yes, if I could perhaps deal with that first, Mr. Dunn.
Yeah.
I think in terms of that is again a catch-up in terms of the modern age in a lot of ways, in that if we were to survey the number of creditors that actually attend those annual meetings, so you tend to get quite a good representation at perhaps an initial meeting. Understandably, because people want to know ultimately, am I going to get any money back here, when, and perhaps put things on the table in terms of things they want investigated. Thereafter, there's a statutory requirement in liquidation processes to convene annual meetings. There is time occupied and indeed cost in doing that, and I think between us all, you ultimately often have no representation at those meetings, or perhaps at best one or two. So it's about giving a facilitation to the creditors still having a voice, but removing the actual necessity to go through the actual formality of the meeting within that.
Okay, and there would be transition arrangements made then to be put in place for the changeover?
Yes. And I think the proposal is that obviously that will continue to apply to anything that is enforced before that is enacted, but going forward then there would not be the requirement to do that on new cases.
I think maybe, Sean, your practice had raised the issue of this, the transitional.
We did. We saw this as, again, an unnecessary cost. You're quite right, Mr Chairman, that if this is enacted, then it will only apply to new cases which start as from whenever the legislation, say, it comes through in 2015, whereas a lot of our cases, we will literally be required to operate two parallel systems, two parallel sets of working papers, one for your cases which are currently in progress and will continue for the next few years, and the new cases where it wouldn't be required. And that was the reason why we made that. So there is a duplication of energies required there, which is just a pity. And I suppose if the legislation could be worded in such a way that it applied to all cases extant at present, that would save us the bother. But we don't see it as a huge issue. I think we're used. Can I say, just as an aside, and Stephen and I were speaking about this before we came in, because the rules in GB often lag behind the rules in Northern Ireland, and these are the rules which follow the legislation. I think we're used to operating parallel systems. So, to an extent, whilst we would like to have it done away with, it's not going to be a deal breaker. It's not going to be a big issue.
So the loss of the AGM wouldn't be significant, really. In many ways, it's about communication.
It would actually save money. It would actually be a benefit, because the cost of setting up, and where you're sending out 400 notices for an AGM and all, and no one turn up, it can be
frustrating.
A bit frustrating, to say the least.
Okay, thanks, gentlemen. Thanks, Chair.
Okay, thanks, Gordon. Mr McKinney, Virgil.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your submission. Can I just deal with the clause 13, and specifically around PwC's written submission? And obviously it makes provision for bank accounts. Doesn't mean that people will get bank accounts. So you've suggested that have a conversation between the department and the banks. Is that the right way forward?
I think, just to clarify the question, Mr McKinney, is in terms of, is it the right way forward in terms of having the ability for discharged bankrupts or bankrupts to have bank accounts, or in terms of the interaction with the banks?
In terms of the interaction with
the banks. I think the point was made in the context of situations where, you know, you're supposed to recover from bankruptcy. It's not bankruptcy for life. You need to encourage people to start again, to go again. It's an important part. The difficult and where we were alluding to is again one of practical implementation, where we can legislate for the fact that you are allowed a allowed a bank account as a bankrupt, but we need the banks to actually buy into that. So it was around how you make that just work most efficiently in practice with the engagement with the banking community to say, you appreciate that's there, they're educated on it and they're applying it.
Yes, but would a conversation between the department and the bank achieve that outcome?
It's a fair question.
It's a very,
Sometimes when we have conversations with the department, we can't achieve it.
I think it's one of education within that. It's often the fact that on the ground they just assume you're bankrupt, you can't have a bank account, which is not the case. So, you know, there's perhaps a piece between the department and, dare I say it, the insolvency profession around the education and awareness piece for the banks within that.
It sounds loose to me. It doesn't. You know, if you're looking to achieve an outcome.
Yeah, the nearest, Mr McKinney, that could come from that, it's interesting that also emerging, funny enough, as part of the regulatory regime is a set of protocols. And a protocol for IVAs, and there is an IVA protocol, and that actually, the British Banking Federation, they actually can come through that. And if in fact it meant that that was included as part of a protocol, and that the Banking Federation had to buy into that, it would mean that at the coalface, whereas today we cannot get bank accounts open for bankrupt, we could then point to the banker in question and say, you are not adhering to your own protocol. And I would suggest that that could be a practical way forward.
And how would you inject that as into the protocol system?
You would make it as part of the protocol. There is an IVA protocol at the moment, and that's only for IVAs. We're talking about bankruptcies. There isn't as such a bankruptcy protocol, but it could be brought in as part of what would.
This would be a shall, must, as opposed to a may or could.
Correct. I do. I think we, in our practice, feel very strongly about this particular point as well. Not to cut across Stephen, but because we are finding a phenomenal number of people who are really in rural environments just cannot get bank accounts opened.
I think
how can you function without?
If we could just add that the reality of what stops, so if we turn that question around and say what stops the banks opening a bank account for a bankrupt at the moment, it's inevitably the internal lawyer who thinks, rightfully so, that there's a potential challenge to whatever that bank transacts, pounds in, pounds out of that account. So the trustee in bankruptcy can come along and potentially attack that. And so, you know, for me, I think if there was the education there, it would be great if we could build it in. But I think of the hurdles to potentially get there, I genuinely believe if there is clearly pointed to the legislation when it applies to the internal legal departments of the banks, that then there's that will effectively deal with the issue.
Yes, but this conversation is taking place, I think, at least in the context of the liability being removed, as is suggested in the legislation. So that's one piece of the work.
Yes.
That you would expect them to open the door, but it would appear to me that there's another piece of work to be done. You're talking about educating, you're talking about protocol, but there seems to be some. But I'm trying to work out where the authority lies to this. Is it in a protocol? Is it in guidelines? Is it in the legislation?
Stephen and I were addressing this issue just as we were waiting to come in to the chamber, and strange that not all that long ago there were meetings between the committee that I represent, the committee of which I chair, and the bankers on an annual basis. And the reason for that, the same reason as why we meet with the Insolvency Service, and it was precisely to address issues, practical issues such as that, and we could say to the bankers, look, this is not working. The bankers out and the coalface are not actually implementing this protocol of whatever. And if we in ITC could go back to the days when we met with the banking people in Northern Ireland, it's not a simple answer to it. It's just literally get round the table and say, would you please ask your members, as Stephen has alluded to, the guys out at the branch offices to go and operate this system now?
Yeah, but do we need more assurance, Chair? Does it sound?
Well, just on that very point, Step Change did say, they were suggesting anyway, that the proposals included in the bill would remove liability from banks in instances of bankrupts or potential bankrupts. So.
Yes, and that's true. We felt that there was always this problem with the definition of what we call, to use our technical jargon, after-acquired property. Now, the problem there was that we, as licensed insolvency practitioners, would be coming after the bank and saying, look here, some of these credits, some of these monies which have come into a bank account, and therefore the banks just merely said, OK, their answer was, we'll not enter into this at all. And so the way around that was for us to say, for the insolvency profession to say, we will not take any action against banks where, and the key word here is in good faith. In good faith, right. You are operating a bank account, and that prevents an IP from taking any legal challenge against a bank. And the key word here is in good faith, because clearly, and I'm sure the members here today would understand that if there is a clear case of some fraud being perpetrated, the insolvency practitioner still has to challenge that transaction.
Yes, right, okay. But does the removing the liability, does that, and in the good faith context, does that remove fully the liability if you've now introduced a good faith concept to it?
On the assumption that frauds only happen once in a blue moon, we would hope so, yeah.
Obviously, good faith and fraud and all those sorts of things don't go hand in hand. So, so liability, if it is fraud, it's illegal, so therefore liability would follow on from that.
Yes, yes. So, to take Mr McKinney's point, the good faith clause should bring the banks back to the table again. I think, in short answer, I think that will work.
Yeah, but I suppose what I'm thinking of is we're talking, the good faith bit comes in after the fact. We want the bank accounts open before the fact. So how do you do that?
Well, I'm hoping that when the banks see the legislation and see it on the statute book, that they will realise now that the opportunity for insolvency practitioners to come after them won't be there unless there is some exceptional, highly exceptional event occurring, and that should enable them to say, right, we will allow now bankrupts to operate bank accounts from here on in. I mean, credit unions do it. We don't understand why there should be a fear on the part of the banks, so I think it should be all right.
Okay,
I would be positive, I'd be hopeful on that.
Thanks, Fergal. Mr Humphrey.
Thanks, Chair. And thank you very much for your time and your presentation. Could I return to clause 14, which clearly, Mr Kavanagh, you were setting out in your evidence, is the one that you have most concern around?
Yes.
The point that the Chairman made in terms of the terminology throughout the national territory.
Yes.
Effectively, you represent the Institute of Chartered Accountants in Ireland.
Yes.
So in terms of dealing with your sister organisations in the rest of the UK, I mean, have you had conversations with them about it?
No, Mr Humphreys. I chair ITC, and maybe the word I forgot to mention is ITC North, which is really, there are two committees. The Institute of Chartered Accountants have two insolvency committees, one in Dublin and one in Belfast. And obviously I chair the one which deals with and looks after Northern Ireland legislation. We do swap and we do exchange minutes of meetings and we relate them, but largely we are the Northern Ireland legislation. We cope with that on its own, and it is self-contained. Yeah,
and that's my point, because in terms of the national territory, it's talking about the United Kingdom holistically as a unit.
Yes.
Because the legislation is being handed down from Europe.
Yes.
So, you know, except that you're part of the Irish Institute, but in terms of what I meant was, in terms of dealing with the other parts of the UK, have you been speaking to your sister organisations in Scotland and Wales or England, if they exist?
We had
the same will apply to them.
Yes, indeed, the same will apply to them. And I would have to say that this is where I have difficulty, in that the desire to ensure that there is a level playing field for all practitioners in the UK, I find myself at a disadvantage, defeating my own argument almost. It's a dilemma that you, I suppose, in life you have to face, and you have to weigh the balance as to which is the greater need. And my dilemma has been, on the one hand, the practical problems that I have, on the other hand, the ability that allowing someone from Plymouth or Norwich or Sheffield to be able to operate in Belfast, I don't have a problem with that. So therefore, that's a requirement. And if, in fact, other legislation, such as, say, for example, human rights legislation or this EC directive, which you've correctly alluded to as an EC directive right across Europe, I have to defer to that. And I think we wanted to come here today to make a case for the practical outworking of it, as opposed to.
Would it not be an idea to speak to them, though, in terms of your equivalents in the other parts of the UK?
I did speak with our homologues in Scotland. We had a word with them, and they struggled with the same idea. And if anyone is aware of the Scottish legislation, they have an even bigger problem, because they actually have deeds of arrangement. They have actual legislation that doesn't apply anywhere else except in Scotland.
But so, I think the point,
advantages of devolution.
I think that's the point in terms of EU directive. It's to create a level playing field across, I presume, the United Kingdom, so that you don't have the anomalies that you're talking about that apply in Scotland because of more sort of in-depth legislation. Can I ask you, Mr. Cave, you represent PricewaterhouseCoopers.
Yes.
You're a national, international, indeed a global company.
Yes.
So in terms of internally in your organisation, you will have had experience of how the other constituent parts of the UK are dealing with this, yes?
Yes.
Right.
But I think back to Mr. Cavanagh's point earlier on in terms of the fact that whilst the legislation has been passed in GB from an enactment point of view and an actual in-practice point of view, we cannot find situations where that has actually come into play. So we don't know the outflow of that as yet. In this stage, I think it's absolutely valid point in terms of liaison, and that goes on a regular basis within an insolvency operations group that we have within our firm. Nobody has actually seen that put to the test yet, and I think ultimately within our own firm we're saying, look, there's nuances of particular geographies within that. Ultimately, can it all work under one umbrella? Yes, it can, though it does then in some way struggle to reconcile back to Sean's point earlier in terms of why within the UK legislation we seem to always have a 2-3 year time lag in terms of implementation, and actually would nearly lead you down to, well, let's take it on a composite basis, and if there's something overriding, to use a term that was used earlier, relating to this geography, then you almost, dare I say it, opt out from that perspective, as opposed to every time this lag. So I can see both sides of that, but I think it's a point well made, Mr.
I accept the point you make about the perhaps we take longer sometimes in terms of implementing, but equally in more recent times we've actually been leading the field in some other areas. But nevertheless, I think you have to keep coming back to the point that it is an EU directive, so there will be no. You talked about an opt-out. I mean, effectively, you know, you're being uncomfortable with clause 14 comes down to the fact that you've got to convince people that there should be an opt-out for Northern Ireland. And the difficulty is, because it's an EU directive, and I think something like 86% of our laws emanate from Europe, tragically, that we have then to negotiate or try and secure an opt-out. And being realistic, if other parts of the UK haven't been able to get that opt-out, how are we going to be able to do it?
Again, I would refer back to my earlier point, and indeed the final paragraph of the PwC submission, and that of saying, look, to defer to that European, as Sean says, in terms of that, this is not this is not going to break the system. It was simply some considerations around some of the practical implications relevant to the nuances of our business environment in Northern Ireland. But I accept you could paint that into perhaps other geographies and regions indeed within. And it's not that it fundamentally means that implementing partial authorisation is going to break the system. It simply then would defer to the final paragraph around making sure that, back to the RPBs within that situation, if they're giving somebody a personal insolvency licence, and back to the point about regulation in terms of that, we need to be sure that ultimately the person or business in distress is getting the best possible advice across the board. So I think it can be dealt with.
Okay.
One just final comment on that, Mr. Humphreys, and that is, when we're talking about a market-led environment, if I want to do IVAs in Scotland, I have no choice but to absolutely tool up and organise myself for deeds of arrangement. Otherwise, I just can't practice there. Simple. And that's market forces. That's Scottish law saying if you want to operate in our environment, you work according to the rules that we've set out, and they have the rules that are completely applicable only in Scotland.
And I think that's the issue, John. That you cannot have an uneven playing field around this issue if it ever exists anywhere. If you're being disadvantaged in terms of practicing in Scotland, yep, which obviously is a larger nation within the UK, then that's something which falls down in terms of this EU directive.
Correct.
And so it's either it applies universally across the kingdom, or there are opt-outs, and I think that's the basis on which you need to go forward. Thanks, Chair.
Okay. Mr. Flanagan. Phil.
Thanks, Patsy, and thanks for your presentation and your patience. Can I ask you a very simple question? What does partial authorisation mean to somebody that knows nothing about insolvency practitioner?
It means that an insolvency practitioner, if this goes ahead, can apply for a licence to take on personal insolvency cases only, or company, corporate cases only, dealing with companies. So in other words, really, someone, and we maybe see this sometimes there, where people will operate with consumer debt, very, very small debtors who have only got maybe £10,000 or £15,000 worth of debt. They are not involved in the work that Stephen and I carry out in our everyday work. And part of me thinks that this legislation is maybe partly going to deal with those kind of people who want to operate in a very, very limited personal field. Where we've the problem is where persons, i.e. individuals who are also directors or have bigger, larger cases and larger financial issues, that's where this legislation is a problem. For the small ones, the people who have small debts, and one thing and that's a different, and those are small, what I call small consumer debt. People who are being dealt with largely, by the way, by CABs, Consumer Advice Bureaus and things like that. That would be the kind of thing that would be the kind of licence which we think that might be imminent.
I would put it more so, if the business in question has limited at the end of it, then it requires a corporate insolvency practitioner. Right. If it doesn't, if it's Stephen Cave trading as ABC, then then it's personal. And I say our world often overlaps back to the earlier comment, but effectively it's right. Yeah. If you don't have limited, and I am partially authorised and I can practice personal insolvency, I can advise you. If you end up bankrupt, I can do your bankruptcy. Yeah. What I can't do is become an administrator, a liquidator of your limited company.
Right, so the thing that's confusing me is the debate around partial authorisation, and then there's a question over the constitutional question. You know, are the two issues overlapping here, or what's the story? You know, because there's all this talk about the national territory. Is that linked to partial authorisation, or are the two separate issues?
No, they're two separate issues.
Okay.
They're two separate issues, no.
And does this EU Services Directive state that if you want to provide insolvency services here, you have to do it all over Britain too?
Well, you have to be able to carry out that function all over Britain, yes. Okay.
Except where it's justified by an overriding reason relating to the public interest?
Yeah, I think the analogy we carry out of if someone had, if in GB someone had a personal insolvency licence, and this is my interpretation of the legislation, say they come from Manchester and they have a personal licence, then by operation of this EU law or EC law, if they wanted to say, I want to apply to do work in Belfast, I can't do it because we wouldn't have the equivalent GB legislation if we decided to have one. If we worked on what we call a dual licensing basis, and I think that's the problem with the law.
So we're saying that somebody in Manchester that's registered for only for personal insolvency wouldn't be allowed to come over here and do personal insolvency?
No, because they would have to have the way the law works at the moment here is that when you have when you are a licensed insolvency practitioner, you are licensed to do both personal and corporate work. You're licensed for both.
But would that restrict somebody from Manchester offering personal work?
If they had a personal only, if they had a personal only licence, if the GB legislation hasn't gone ahead yet now, but if say it goes ahead in spring 2015, which apparently is scheduled, and if that person in Manchester had a personal only licence, then they couldn't operate here.
But they can at the minute.
Oh, they can at the moment. Oh, there's no problem at the moment.
But and William tried to blame all this on the EU, and that's dead on. He can try, but the briefing document clearly states that Daddy believes that specialisation would lead to benefits, and I think we'd all agree with that. You know, for some cases, having a specialised insolvency practitioner may well be useful. Like I presume within your practice, you have people that specialise in corporate, and you have people that specialise.
We do.
But I appreciate there's a difference between an individual and an organisation. So I accept the department's point that specialisation could lead to benefits, but I also accept your point that having a practice that can do everything under the one roof makes sense. If you have the example of a small business owner or a farmer or somebody that has corporate interests as well, I certainly think that makes sense. But in terms of you know, an overriding reason relating to the public interest, which is the quote consider the EU Services Directive. Has anybody tried to put forward the logic of the fact that there's a stretch of water between here and Britain as an overriding reason relating to the public interest as to why this directive may not need to be applied here? Or has any logic been put forward as to why you think we can get a derogation from this whole question of the national territory? Because I think that's where we need to go.
I would, with respect, say that that's outside my competency to make a comment on that matter. In our submission, we concentrated on the practical outworkings of where we see that, apart from the very small debtor, and I keep referring to this point, the very small consumer debt cases, a lot of the other cases will involve both corporate. We see an advantage in the dual. I suppose, in simple language, our view is if it's not broken, don't fix it.
Okay, I hear you, Sean, but we need a solution. And I understand what you're saying about the implications of it. But in terms of finding a solution, if the law was worded in such a way that what was offered here was both the dual system that exists at the minute, but also the specialisms that DETI want to propose. So if they had maybe 3 different types of licence, so if they had one for individuals, one for corporate, and then a dual licence, and what would your opinion on that be?
In principle, I wouldn't have any objection to that. I feel that the dual licence is a huge advantage. As I've outlined earlier on here, we find in our practical work, having a dual licence is a very distinct advantage. But in theory, apart from the cost of it, I think what and Carb alluded to this, Carb did say, insofar as it carried out a kind of a check on the members, there wasn't a big appetite for individual-only licence amongst our members, amongst the members, the current IPs. There may well be, and I do want to be fair here, there may well be an appetite amongst, in the world of small consumer debt, where indeed a specialism, in fact, dealing with small consumer debt, which I wouldn't have a competency to deal with at all. So if someone come in with small things, for example, issues concerning a lot of social security debt and issues like that, that's where your specialism is an advantage. That we would submit is a very, very, very minuscule, a very small and a small field, and it's not the field that we deal with. But we can't say that it doesn't exist. Okay,
but that proposition I put to you, can you go and think about that and reflect on what it would look like? Talk to some of your members and maybe come back to it, because it might be something that we could ease out. But we have to find a solution here that meets everybody's needs, that meets the needs of people here, but also communities with legislation and with what DETI want to
a triple
achieve.
system you're referring to.
That's a solution I think we could maybe tease out more. In terms of, and I suppose your answer to that can answer this next question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. So, is your opposition to clause 14 a commercial one to protect your own firm, or is it based on the needs of citizens and people here?
Absolutely not. I would hope that the committee will recognise here, whilst I am representing Gavin Kelly, we and I would say this for the insolvency profession, I'd say it without any hesitation at all, we consider that this will add extra layer of cost, which ultimately the public pay for.
I would second that, Mr. Flanagan, and also add to, within the, again off the theme of it, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. There are a lot of licensed insolvency practitioners who have done exams, who hold licences to do both corporate and personal work presently, who choose, whether that be one of commercial reasons, whether that be other reasons, to specialise and say, I'm only doing typically personal insolvency work, or I don't do personal insolvency work, is probably the more common, I'll do corporate. So again, I would second without adding to it, from the firm's point of view, what Sean has said within that. But I say the system caters for go and get your licence, you're competent across the piece, but then specialise, and back to the legal argument before, become a lawyer, but then decide to specialise in matrimonial law or otherwise in that.
But in terms of in terms of the demand there are for services, you know, the whole rationale for changing the insolvency bill is all to do with, a lot of it's to do with the length of time it's taken and the huge demand there is for services. Do you think that the bill is going to do enough to address that issue?
Sorry, I mean,
perhaps clarify.
No idea what I'm talking about. I'll rephrase the question maybe in proper English. There's a huge demand for insolvency services at the minute, and one of the things we've been told that the bill aims to do is to streamline that, to deal with the backlog there is, to make it easier for people to get through this process. Do you think the bill will achieve that?
If I could maybe touch on that, I don't think there's any backlog, as it were, within the provision of insolvency services. You know, specifically within the province or indeed wider within that. and there's nothing specifically within that bill that is going to hugely accelerate. But likewise, I don't think there's a need to accelerate. Just to clarify.
My final question is around the Tomlinson report. Are you aware of it?
Yes.
Yes.
And the work of RBS and their global restructuring group, where businesses were put under pressure from RBS, where good and viable firms were forced really into liquidation so that the bank could make more money. Firstly, have you any evidence that was happening here? Because there was no evidence produced that it was happening here, but claims were made that it was happening here. Through your work, have you any evidence that any of that activity was happening here?
Again, I can only comment on my specific knowledge in terms of cases that I have been involved in, whether with that specific institution or wider within the banking sector. And I would say no, that whilst there is different people will hold different views in circumstances as regards to the reasons why something went into insolvency, and 80% plus, not an exact science figure, but of situations in the last 6-7 years have been property-related failures in relation to that. You will always have two sides to a story. I have certainly, but to answer your question specifically, not come across any circumstances where it would specifically apply to the parameters and the criteria you outline.
Have you, Sean?
I would second that as well, and we would have direct experience of working on reconstructions and corporate reconstructions, and we would have no evidence that there was anything along the lines of what you've outlined in the Tomlinson report of that kind of activity being paramount in relation to the achieving an overall result. No.
And were you working with RBS?
We were working with Ulster Bank,
yes,
which is really we have done a lot of work with GRG, which is we've been heavily involved with GRG and the Ulster Bank.
Just to clarify as well, which might be helpful for the committee, just to paint a picture in relation to that, because the commonly held view is that an insolvency situation is driven by the bank has appointed in those situations, therefore you're acting for the bank. Just to clarify, and certainly again speak from my personal situation, and that is, we will take instructions on occasions for the bank to look at the bank options, but likewise we will have as many situations, particularly in recent years, where you're acting corporate side and you're acting on the corporate side in trying to facilitate a restructuring with the bank to avoid insolvency, and hence I have seen that from very much both sides of that equation.
And in terms of this bill, are there any possible changes that could be made to the proposed legislation to protect good and viable businesses from being forced into the liquidation, into insolvency to make banks or other financial firms more money?
Sorry, it's the last sentence, the last part of the sentence, to protect
good and viable firms from being forced into insolvency in a drive to make banks more money.
CVAs, I suppose, really are designed to try and the CVA process is designed to prevent the insolvency process kicked in, and I mean we would be involved with many CVAs, and I've operated CVAs, so really the process is already there. There is no necessity, I think, for any extra layer. That process is already in place at the moment through that legislation.
I would agree. I don't think there's anything else that needs introduced within the bill. But just to caveat, I don't believe there are businesses that are forced into insolvency. From that perspective, and there is sufficient room within the parameters within the formal legislation and the guidance under which practitioners operate to achieve viable restructures. I think the biggest challenge to that, just to add one final comment to that, the biggest challenge to that is people, and it has got better, people as in the business community seeking the professional help with that at an earlier stage, whilst there are many options open.
Thanks for that.
Okay, right, thanks, Phil. All right, gentlemen, thanks very much indeed for your time and coming along to us here today. Just one final thing, Stephen. I was listening very carefully to you earlier there. The difference between personal and corporate, and if somebody comes into you and says, I'm limited company, and the other, well, clearly they aren't. At that point in time, say we went the route, or say the partial authorisation at that point in time, should a 5-minute conversation not very clearly and very quickly determine for that person, look, I'm the wrong person for you, or I'm the person to deal with it?
Theoretically, yes, is a straightforward answer, Mr. Chairman, to the question. I think what we, and again, but I accept you could pull this in any region in terms of the nuances. Personal guarantees were a massive issue, particularly in this province, associated with property debt. So where you had a limited company, but the impact and trying to walk through from a director's responsibility point of view, and a personal situation with a personal guarantee in the background, is a clear overlap of those two worlds. But yes is a straightforward answer to the question.
Okay.
But I would say it can be difficult enough to get that out within that sort of time period. But yes is a straight answer.
They should know whether they've a limited company or not.
Oh, yes, I think so, Mr. Chairman, but they don't. I would support Stephen in this.
Yes.
They are not aware of the fact that they have other involvements, or they have involvement with not just limited companies, partnerships.
Partnerships are very
Partnerships is
important
another
piece.
problem as well.
Okay, right, thanks very much indeed. Conscious of pressures in your time, and certainly on my own here, I have another meeting to go to too. But thank you, you've devoted a lot of time to us here, and thank you again for your involvement in other issues as well. I know that you've been very helpful on other occasions. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Right. Now, I think really, gentlemen, because it's all gentlemen we have here today, I think we need to ask the department back on this. Agreed? Agreed? Okay. So it has all been Hansarded here anyway, and we can go through the details and raise the issues with them. Now, I've got less than 10 minutes because of another meeting to chair, so there's some stuff we have to get through here very, very quickly.
It's better lunch at it than there is at ours.
What's that, Phil?
This is must be better lunch at it than there is at ours.
No, there's not actually.
It's an all-party group or something?
No, it's the chairperson's liaison
You have
group.
wraps or something, I
So,
suppose.
Phil, I might be calling on your services here to wrap her up. So,
We'll have no quorum, Patsy, there'll be no point.
no, we will. Will. You will. Aye.
5, 4.
I'm living too.
Okay, can we move to agenda item number 6? That's matters arising. There are 2 items in the matters arising index. That's on page 43. Okay. So if members are content to note the 2 items in the index. Table today is also agreed to note. Yes. Great. Table today is also a response from Invest NI to members' questions following briefing on Invest NI's mid-year outturn figures. This is at page 15 in tabled figures. Okay. Tabled papers, rather. So if members are content to forward the response, I think it would be important that we do this to Leslie Budd, the specialist advisor, and get him to look through them and scrutinise them and come back to us on it. Agreed?
I don't like the fact that they're coming back saying, you know, a sub-regional performance is not yet available and results are not currently collated in the format proposed. But, you know, they didn't give us any format. You know, number 7 here, they've given us 5 lines, and it says the results aren't collated in the format proposed. Can they give
Page yet, Phil, just...
Page 19, here, Patsy.
Okay.
Right. No, you don't give them, to say they're not in the format proposed, they don't give them to us in any format.
Yeah, though, well, do they have them in a format?
Well, they can give them in some format. It mightn't be the format that
It
Jim
used to
specifically
be, used to have
requested.
figures for district council areas, didn't they? Or constituencies.
I've seen that before.
Aye, I've
They had
seen
them
certain
there. I think
constituencies.
it was interesting to note there that Cavan Kelly created more jobs in Fermanagh last year than Derry did.
Aye. Another line insurance
Right, Gordon?
group there, so. Right, can we,
Sir, the other point I think is very significant is the number of business and financial services that
yes.
have been created, and we you know, want to see manufacturing more and more pushed to the fore, and I think it's
Mike Gordon, I was just looking at it and I was wondering, Autoline Insurance Group, and what way do they manufacture?
Who?
You see there, number 59,
What page are you on?
59.
page 20
Okay.
of the announcements.
Yeah. It's obviously one of these support
All sorts of
services.
things. Aye.
Would it come in under business and financial services?
Would do.
Must do, aye. Anyway,
But again,
Right.
would like to see a greater emphasis on manufacturing. I think that's my point.
and I think too, if we could ask them, what format can they provide them to us in? Is it constituency, is it district council area? Agreed then, we ask that, okay. Now, also tabled today is a response to the committee's request for details of any underspend on the agri-food loan scheme. This was at page 22. It appears they have committed something, but they haven't spent anything of the 10 million. 768,000 has been approved, but I don't think it's been spent. They're relating there. They're saying the reason is partly due to planning issues. I would like to clarify what those were, if we could find out from Invest NI what those are and how many issues are outstanding, because I know this was raised before, and whenever we went and saw detail on it, it seemed that it maybe wasn't as big an issue as what had been portrayed to us. Agreed? Okay.
You're going to discuss this, Chair, sorry, at the joint meeting?
Aye.
Yeah, these
We
sort of
need to.
issues?
We would have to.
Good. Right, thank you.
Yes. Now, agenda item number 7 is legislative consent motion UK Small Business Enterprise and Employment Bill. Papers for the item include the draft report for the LCM, that's at page 51, the LCM at page 53. And so if members are content with the draft report and the LCM, and to forward the report to the Committee for Finance and Personnel for information. Agreed? Yep. Now, agenda item number 8, this is Budget 2015-2016. Tabled today is an updated response to the Committee for Finance and Personnel, which includes the responses from stakeholders. That's page 25 of the tabled papers. We have a written briefing from the Department, page 62. Additional information that had been requested at page 28. A response from the Committee for Agriculture and Rural Development, page 71. Briefing from the Cathedral Quarter Trust at page 31. A response from NIAPA and a response from the UFU. That's page 34 and 35 of tabled papers. Now, are members content with the draft response to the Committee for Finance and Personnel?
Yeah.
Sorry, no, there is. Sorry, wait a minute. There is an issue that Jim well spotted. Should have been an accountant. You should have been the other side of the table with those guys, Jim, earlier. There are some sort of anomalies within the percentages and figures that have been presented to us that Jim has noticed here. So it may well be the case that we present those and ask clarification from the department whenever they're in, the officials, after a minute or two on this. Agreed?
Which ones are we talking about?
Jim, do you want to
28, 29?
clarify this?
It's this response that came in table papers. It came very late yesterday evening, and I did a bit of maths on it. It's this table, which is what page is that on?
28, 29?
28, 29, then it's table papers. The department has stated here that the Deputy Resource Budget for 2014-2015, excluding the Tourism Ireland Resource Budget and the Intertrade Ireland Resource Budget, is 169 million. You see at the bottom of the table there, the bottom left. Okay.
Yep, next
No,
exhibit
it's not
yep.
28 and 29 on table papers.
It's page 20.
Page 29, yeah.
Here it is. That's the one.
Yes, page 29.
25? 20.
Yeah, 29.
No, it's not 29 in mine. This is Jim Carmichael from NIAPA. 25, page 25 in the tabled ones. I don't know, maybe some of them are a wee
Well,
bit.
sorry, there was an additional papers issued.
Yes,
It's
it's
this, table,
29.
it's this table here. The top it says supplementary information sought by the ETI committee.
Oh, we have you, Jim. Me and Gordon's here. There's 5 minutes.
So the very last row on the table says 2014-2015.
Yes.
Yeah.
The Deputy Resource Budget is 169
Yes.
million.
Thanks.
Okay, and then it gives you Tourism Ireland and the Intertrade Ireland budgets as well.
Does.
When you add those three up, it comes to 181, almost 182 million. Okay. In the paper that arrived on spending and savings proposals from last year, the resource budget following in-year monitoring was 198 million.
Yeah.
So those two figures don't match now.
100 and what, sorry, Jim?
198.8 million. So
Where do
that
you get
was
that out of?
following in-year budget. Now, when you take that 198.8 million and subtract the Tourism Ireland and Intertrade Ireland budget from it, the total results in a 4.8% reduction in DETI's budget rather than the 11.2% that is.
Jim, do you see the
presented
table
in
on
figures.
page 28 that says 184? What's the difference in that table and the table you're talking about?
That's the one over the
The
page.
one previous, supplementary.
I just you're referring to this document here, Jim.
Does that adds up?
Aye.
The 198 million.
Where are you getting 198 million out of?
That's, you better clarify.
That's the headline
The
figure.
198 million is the spending and savings proposal that was considered by the committee last week in relation to the budget.
Right.
Yes.
So that said that the resource budget for 2014-15, following in-year monitoring, was 198.8
This is
million.
2015-16.
The figure here at the bottom of the table is 2014-2015.
Right. With you.
Right.
With you now.
Bill, can I ask you, please, could you take over here, could you?
We'll be here all day.
I don't know if I'm in a position to, hugely confused with Jim's at, but maybe he'll whisper.
Yep.
Keep her
Sorry,
moving.
We'll leave, there's just one item here, first of all. If we're content to forward the correspondence from the Cathedral Quarter, NIAPA and UFU to the department,
Great.
because there's some key issues there. Yes, Jim,
Great.
what were you saying there? Happy enough with that? Okay, and then, well, you can take over here now, you okay? Okay, so we'll see you in a minute or two, hopefully. All right, thanks, Phil.
Great. Ready to go, Gordon?
Patsy, you'll be missed.
Great. Where's the chair?
See you later.
Was that again there, Jim?
No.
I know.
I'm hugely confused, Ted. There's one there.
Too
Look.
late in the term. Maybe.
In the figures that were presented last year,
Jim in the wrong job.
Right.
2014-15 resource budget following
Yeah.
year monitoring. These figures say that,
So you want to know why there's a difference?
yeah, no, but
Right.
presumably the difference is following in year monitoring, and this was the original figure.
Right.
But it still leaves the question, you're now comparing like with like.
Yeah.
And this was well, 11.2 compared
Yeah.
to Intertrade Ireland's 12.
Right. So you want to see clarity from the department on those
I
figures?
thought the committee might want to see clarity.
I know. I think you're leading the charge here, Jim. We'll back you to the hilt. Members happy to see clarity from the department on those figures. And
Yep.
Sorry, I think what the chair had been proposing before he left was that the officials that are coming in and in-year monitoring, they're
Oh, is
on
Trevor out there, is
standby, that they could
Right.
possibly answer these
That'd be a
questions
good
when we
idea.
come to that item on the agenda.
we're going to move to agenda item 11 when we finish with the budget. Then. No.
That might be appropriate.
Okay.
That-
Right. So we finished agenda item 8. We're going to move to agenda item 11 now.
Well, the other thing, if you
That's in
could
here.
move to agenda, get officials in, because it may result in changes to this memo to the Finance Personnel Committee, depending on what
Okay. So
officials
can we bring them in
So-
for agenda item 8?
Yeah,
Right. So that's
and then follow up immediately with agenda item.
no problem. There's a great perception here that I know what I'm doing.
Music on?
There's a party on out there. There's a special school doing a concert upstairs.
Band.
Do you want to?
Inveigh School Rock Band.
What is it?
Jim, you lead the questions there. How you doing? Sorry we dragged you away from the party there, Trevor.
Thank you.
We're going to deal with agenda item number 8 first, which is the budget.
Right.
If you're happy to take a couple of questions on that, we want to seek some clarity before we
Sure.
sign off on our response to the Committee for Finance and Personnel. At the spending and savings proposals document you gave us last year, last week. Been a long day, Trevor. The proposals you gave us last week, there was a resource budget following in year monitoring of 198.8 million for 2014-15, and a resource budget for 2015-16 of 184. But the supplementary information that we've sought and we've been given for this week's committee meeting
Yep.
indicates that the resource budget, excluding the north-south bodies, was 169 million. But when you add the north-south bodies on, it goes to nearly 182. So the figure we've got this week is that the DETI resource budget in total is roughly 182 million. But the document you gave us last week said it was 198.9. But that's following in-year monitoring. So is the difference there that there was in-year monitoring provided of around 17 million during the year to DETI? Is that what fills the gap?
In-year monitoring would, if we're talking about a post-in-year monitoring figure, there would be in-year allocations and actually reductions in the 15-16 figure. So we would have been subject to cuts of around about 8.1 million, I believe, 8.1.
2014-15?
Sorry, you're talking about 14-15?
Yeah. We're talking about the resource budget following in-year monitoring that you gave us last week, and the supplementary information, and the document you gave us with supplementary information today gives
Right.
us a resource budget figure of 182.
Okay.
There's a difference of about 17 million there.
Right. Well, one would be a opening budget position at the start of the year, and the other would be a final outturn position. So it would have in-year allocations included in it, and if there were any in-year reductions. There would be in-year reductions as well, so that would be the difference between the two. Now,
So the figure of 198.8 is the final outturn for the department for the year?
yes.
Okay, but this document here, you've given us
Yes.
the supplementary information one.
Yes.
Because you've used the other figure of 182 million instead of the figure of 198.8, what that does is put out a perception that the department itself, excluding north-south bodies, has faced a much greater cut than it actually has.
Well,
Whereas, you know, the figure you have here is a reduction of 11.2%. But if you take the actual figure for the resource budget that you've actually spent, there's a reduction of 4.8%, which makes the implications of what the change in the figure you've used, it makes the budget allocation in the north-south bodies seem much more reasonable, and the cut seem an awful lot more comparable.
well, I think if you to compare like for like, I think you need to look at it on a what is your rolled forward baseline that you can rely on. So,
But we're looking backwards here.
well, we're looking at is we're looking forwards in terms of the reductions that are being made to DETI. We're also looking at reductions that are being made to north-south bodies. Now, when you look at the starting budget position, the starting budget position for DETI next year will be its rolled forward position. It will not be its position with allocations in year. So the like-for-like comparison would be the rolled forward position.
But surely the proper comparison to take is what you actually spent, not what you wanted to spend, but what you actually spent.
Well, if you were to do that, you would be saying then the department would be subject to even more significant cuts. You would have to apply the in-year allocations as reductions, so you'd be showing a much bigger actual reduction in the department's baseline. So it's, I think the most fair and appropriate way to look at this is on a rolled forward baseline, because that's the only baseline the department can rely on going forward.
But I'm not disputing that, Trevor.
Yeah.
But I'm looking at the 2014 figures here, which you're telling me the department in total, including north-south bodies, had a resource budget of 182, and therefore your budget reduction in the department next year is 11.2%. But in actual fact, the department was allocated 198.8 million for 2014-15 and will face a budget reduction of 4.8%. And when you compare that to the budgetary reductions within Intertrade Ireland, which is 12.3%, and Tourism Ireland, which is 5.1%, the department's getting off an awful lot easier than the two north-south bodies.
I don't think that's the case.
Sorry, Tourism Ireland's increased by 5.1%, but Intertrades has been reduced by 12.3%. And the implications of the figure you've given us is that it looks like the department has faced a similar reduction in its budget.
Well, because that's the case. That's a fact. The department's budget is the budget that is allocated to the department. The department's rolled forward budget are the numbers that we're reporting to you. So it is a fact. The reductions that we're reporting are a factual position. Now, if you're saying we should be applying as a reduction to the department's baseline, also we should increase it and then reduce it to get back to the rolled forward position in terms of the reduction that you would apply to take out any in-year allocations, then you'd have a much bigger reduction against the department's line.
You would, but your numbers also wouldn't add up because you'd have cut that reduction twice.
Well,
but if you look at what I'm talking about, Trevor, is the comparison with last year, not the projection for next year. The projection for next year is the projection for next year. What I'm talking about is the comparison with last year and the reduction in the budget allocation to the department compared with what it actually spent.
But the reduction, if you're trying to compare the reduction in the budget's allocation or in the department's allocation from what it's actually spent, then you would need to apply as a reduction the in-year allocation.
What I'm actually trying to compare, Trevor,
in terms of in terms of the reduction that would be applied to the department going forward versus what it had previously spent in outturn, you would then have a much much bigger reduction in terms of the department spend.
But what I'm actually trying to compare is the historical spend within DETI with the spend within Tourism Ireland and Intertrade Ireland.
Right.
And it's quite clear to see that organisations like Intertrade Ireland have been triply hit by the cuts to the department, because the implication of the department making a £1 million cut to Intertrade Ireland's budget is that its budget's cut by £3 million, because of the way it's funded by the 2-to-1 ratio. So Intertrade Ireland shouldn't simply face the same percentile cut that the department faces. But that's what this document says is that Tourism Ireland or Intertrade's budget decreased by 12.3% and DETI's budget decreased by 11.2%. But the figures look comparable. But they're not comparable because, you know, DETI's budget hasn't decreased anywhere near the same percentage rate as Intertrade Ireland's.
Well, as we roll forward into next year, our roll forward baseline, subject to obviously the further cuts that would be applied, will be the rolled forward baseline position as we're reporting it. So, on a like-for-like basis, I believe that table actually does give you the comparison of the position.
So in terms of this,
I think if we were to present a table showing the department spend last year versus its starting point this year, there would be a much bigger reduction.
well, you see this table here you've given us, Trevor, which shows the department's resource budget excluding north-south bodies. Can you give us a similar table that shows us the department's resource budget including in-year monitoring, so what the department actually spent in a financial year as opposed to what it was allocated at the start of the financial year?
We can, certainly. Yep.
Okay. Have members any other questions on the budget papers?
On the budget.
Just the one thing that was raised again last year. Obviously, this is from our perspective, but Intertrade is jointly funded, and there is a danger, a potential danger that it gets a bigger cut as a result of, and what discussions are taking place to mitigate that.
In percentage terms, I think the reduction wouldn't be any bigger in total, in terms of total budget. I know that our colleagues in our sponsor branches have had a lot of engagement with our counterpart department, and we're hopeful that we can move to an agreed position in terms of its budget allocation going forward. So I'm hopeful that we'll get agreement on that.
Okay, thank you.
Right. Members, are we content to add a section into the draft response to the Committee for Finance and Personnel on the fact that we're requesting more information from the department on the actual expenditure of the department since the start of this period, and happy for the Chair to approve that final draft subject to that paragraph being added.
Great, yeah.
Great. So are members content with the draft response to the committee, because it has to be sent as soon as we can to them? All right. We move on to agenda item 11, which is the January monitoring round. Members, you'll find papers for this at page 97 and from the department at page 98. Trevor, do you want to give us a brief overview as to what's included in the paper?
Yeah, we've presented in the paper our full return as we know it at this point in time. I think the final due date with DFP for all monitoring input is the 2nd of January 2015. So normally it would be in two parts. We've encompassed as much as we can, both parts, into the information that we've given to the committee. If there's any movement between now and the 2nd of January, we'll provide you with an update. Just in terms of the actual return itself then, we've submitted a financial transactions bid for 2.1 million, and this in essence has two parts to it. It's a bid in essence of 5 million in relation to the growth loan fund, and the reason that we're bidding there is to ease the pressure on the EU competitiveness programme drawdown in future in next year. So we're bidding in year for the growth loan fund. There's an easement of around about 3 million in relation to agri-loan, so the net bid then is 2.1 million. So a bid and an easement, giving a net bid of 2.1. InvestNI is bidding for 900,000 capital grant in relation to support to business. We can partially meet that. We have 130,000 that we can allocate to partially offset that bid, which effectively leaves us with a bid of 770,000 capital grant to the centre. I would be pretty hopeful that that there's capital available at the centre to meet that bid, so hopefully that will get sorted out. We're effecting some residual tidying up changes from the June and October rounds on the database in terms of this monitoring round, which will meet pressures that we'd previously flagged in InvestNI. So those are tidying up the database in terms of reductions that we'd previously made. We have a number of de minimis reallocations to meet pressures. That includes 157,000 of admin, which is really a technical adjustment, although we require budget cover for it. So DFP have informed us of a revised way of working out accrued employee entitlements at the year end, and the effect of that change in formula has effectively created 157,000 pressure within the department. We have 112,000 in relation to the renewable heat incentive administration costs. So that is administered by Ofgem. We had a bid met in an earlier monitoring round, and this bid for 112 for this reallocation of funding meets the total cost for the year of the administration. Final thing just to touch on in terms of substantive items would be a transfer of 830,000 in relation to social economy hubs that we believe will be affected in this monitoring round. So we bid in 2 previous monitoring rounds. This is a final round that money can be transferred. We're engaging colleagues in both DSD and OFM in relation to the transfer of that funding. There's a couple of reallocations on the EU side. The largest one is effectively driven by the growth loan fund movement that we talked about earlier. So there's 7 million odd reduction in capital grant on the EU side. That's because we're moving the growth loan fund out of the EU programme and putting it into mainstream financial transactions funding, which eases that pressure, and that's the reason for the reduction in here, or the main reason. So essentially that's the items that I
don't think there'll be a pile of questions on it, Trevor. It's very short, but I have 2 for you. As you'll be aware, and I asked you about this the last time, Tambourne are taking a legal challenge against DETI and DOE with regards to the fracking in Fermanagh, and that's listed for further hearing in February. Have the department set aside any funds to fight that, or will that be funded centrally, or will it be funded through the DOE, or what's the story with that?
If there are costs that ultimately fall to us, then we would fund them.
But will you be funding it with the DOE?
I'm sorry, I don't have that.
But have you the resources available, or will you have to bid into the monitoring round?
Any costs that we would have sight of should be able to be met within our budget. Any that we know that would fall to us at this point in time. But I can come back and. Do you
know if you have set aside funding for it, or is it a contingency fund for such things?
Well, I wouldn't anticipate that any legal costs that we would be incurring at this stage would be massive. So, the sorts of sums that you would be talking about, then we would be able to meet from within our overall budget easements in other areas. So I don't see that there would be a difficulty in.
And have you had any discussions about what happens if the department loses the legal challenge and is forced to pay out compensation, where that money would come from?
I wouldn't be cited on whether that might be, what possibility there might be there. So, sorry, I'm
But have you had any discussions about setting aside funds for it?
Well, look, I don't think we're at the point in time to say that there would be any significant likelihood that the department would have lose a legal action that would result in significant funding that would fall to the department. So on that basis, we haven't set any funding aside, because we don't see that there would be any significant risk that falls to the department.
My second question is around the Titanic project. Titanic project, Titanic Belfast, and the 18 million in EU funds that wasn't allowed to be used to spend on that project, and the desire then to find other projects to spend the 18 million pound on. Was that money ever spent? Do you know?
That will have been spent. Yeah.
Do you know where it was? What it was spent on?
It'll have been spent across a range of projects. What I do know is that the full EU funding under that programme is forecast to be drawn down. So that'll be drawn down across a range of the ETI areas, including R&D, tourism. I think the follow-up briefing that we gave the committee in relation to the questions that were asked last week notes that there's a pretty significant capital allocation next year in relation to, I believe it's is it the waterfront? So there's quite a significant amount of capital being spent through the Tourist Board for tourism type.
Well, can you give us a breakdown of the projects that are funded through that 18 million pound that was originally intended for Titanic Belfast that's been redirected within the department?
We can certainly give you a breakdown of how the overall programme will be allocated across the various themes and across various departments. I'm not sure if any other departments are going to be part of the programme now. I know there was potential that DHSS PS might have taken some part of the programme, but I'm not certain that any funding will fall to health now. So, yeah, certainly we can come back to you.
Thanks, Robert.
Well, thank you. Just a couple of things. Can I just go for that 7.6 million again?
Sure.
Just that's a reallocation. Is that money gone, or what? This is a reclassification.
In essence, when we look at an EU programme, we have to look at the exchange rates. So we look at the sterling amount that we anticipate that we'll be able to spend on foot of the EU receipts. And sterling has strengthened significantly over the recent period. So in terms of our forecasts going forward, there would be less sterling spending power from the equivalent amount of EU funding that would be drawn down. So we're taking action effectively to offset that pressure from a future sort of loss of sterling spending power from the same amount of EU, from the same amount of euro receipts. So that's effectively dealing with a future pressure. And it's an effective way of doing it by utilising financial transactions funding that the centre are trying to encourage people to spend. So I think it's, as I said, a pretty imaginative way of trying to solve a problem in advance by our EU colleagues.
And just one other thing, obviously our previous conversations have been to do with committed issues around major tourism events, etc., etc., etc.
Yeah.
But there's nothing in here in relation to those. Is there a reason for that?
Well, my understanding is that we would have the funding for any tourism initiatives that could spend in year. So that would be the reason that there wouldn't be anything else. So,
but is that a signal of a new kind of a discipline coming into play in relation to monitoring?
Well, I think it's a reflection of the reality of where we are. So unless and until we get to effectively a final budget position for next year, we'll have a better sight on the sort of funding that we could provide events going forward. So, I can't prejudge whether or not there will be some further allocation next year for events. That's ultimately dependent on where the draft budget ends up at final. So it's a reflection of the limited of funding at the moment.
And just finally, obviously with all the pressures, and this is across the board, it's at least the suspicion that the monitoring rounds won't be
I agree.
reliable or something we can lean on. So are we feeling that now almost immediately?
Well, I think in terms of planning in year for next year, I think until we see how it plays out, I think one would need to be prudent in terms of the assumptions you make about how much money would be available in year.
Yeah. Okay, sorry, I said finally, but that actually throws up another issue. Does that mean then that departments will be overbidding to protect themselves?
No, I don't think so. I think, I think ministers are approaching the budget with a realistic view to recognise the overall position of the bloc and put forward proposals that really are essential, but not to overbid, but to bid for the things that are going to, that really are the highest priority. Because, well, I'm not going to do DFP's job for them, but if I was in the DFP minister's shoes, I'd be looking to see, look, are these absolutely your highest priorities? So I think certainly that's the approach that we're applying.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Stephen?
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Trevor. A kind of general point as opposed to a specific one to this monitoring round. When we spoke before, I highlighted what I thought to be both foreseeable and inescapable pressures that you were bidding for in monitoring rounds.
Mm-hmm.
You said that was common practice. I argued it wasn't good practice, from my point of view. And I think that's some of what Fergal was touching on. I can accept I come at these things relatively new, so I thought I'll raise it with the Finance Minister. He said, I share the member's concern on the issue. All departments must treat the allocations set through the budget process as ceilings and should seek to manage their activities to contain spend within those ceilings, taking account of all foreseeable pressures. The guidance issued by my department is quite clear on this matter. There's maybe been a necessity to move away from that approach, given, as it's been discussed, monitoring rounds are going to be less generous.
Yeah.
But would you accept that it's good practice to move away from that type of form of budget?
I absolutely accept the generality of the Finance Minister's statement, absolutely 100%. But specifically in relation to DETI, there was a separate executive recognition at the time of the budget realignment when funding was taken, specifically from the DETI Invest NI baseline due to the economic downturn, that when the economy picked up, those inescapable calls would be required to be met. And the only way, in the absence of a budget process, that you can effect that is through in-year monitoring. So absolutely 100% accept the Finance Minister's position, which is a general position across departments, but specifically there was an executive position.
I accept the particular issue with Invest NI and the commitments to business when those businesses were in a position to, I suppose, actualise their projects. My issue at the time in that particular monitoring round, there were what were deemed inescapable pressures for events that were annual, that the department is funded annually. For me, that's foreseeable. If it happened last year and you're likely to fund it next year, budget for it at the start of the year, rather than wait till the monitoring round goes, we've committed to funding this. And that was my issue with that particular, the last monitoring round, that there were foreseeable, predictable annual events that the department had committed to and was bidding for them in monitoring rounds.
And received funding in monitoring for
and
them.
Was successful.
In recognition of how important the spend was in relative terms to other priorities across the executive. So
that important, then you should budget for it in your...
Well, you can only budget for it if, you're in this budget process, if we're certainly putting forward proposals on events and have put forward proposals. So it's not a question of not trying to budget for us. That the ultimate ability to support them will be dependent on the allocation at final budget. So we certainly are budgeting for them.
But if you can't budget for them at the outset, the budget's not there, you don't get the funding you're seeking, and you don't make a commitment. You know, my point is you have to have the budget before you make a commitment. In this case, it seems to me the commitment was made and then you sought the budget.
Well,
and what happens then if the DFP turns around and says no?
you deal with those circumstances if they arise on the basis that the DFP or the executive has deemed your bid to be a lower priority than you would have viewed it in terms of the success of such a bid in year. And we were pretty clear that we thought those were pretty high priority bids, which we believed would be successful.
Is this type of budget in a way almost enforcing DFP's hand and saying this should be a priority because we've committed to it?
Well, personally, I don't believe so, but you know, I think we have moved on into a phase where it may be that less money comes out in year. We have put forward bids for our priorities. We'll see where the draft budget ultimately takes us. We briefed you on the implications of the reductions. So unless there's any movement between now and final budget, it's going to be pretty tricky across all of our bodies.
I suppose then my question in that is, when you receive the final budget, will your commitments be kept within the limits of that budget?
Well, we'll have to manage within the final budget allocation.
Thank you.
Gordon? Thanks, Chair. Thanks, Trevor. Just one quick one. 157,000 admin for additional accrued employment benefit costs. What does that entail?
That is a purely technical, or the reason for that is a purely technical issue. Essentially what that relates to is accrued holiday pay at the year end. So we have to take account of the costs of holidays that would be due to people but haven't yet been taken as at the 31st of March. When DFP informed us of a new way of calculating the formula, new way of calculating how much that would cost. And when we looked at that new formula versus the old way of calculating it, that's the difference. So it's solely on foot of a revised notification of a formula of how much the total accrued holidays that haven't been taken yet would cost.
So are staff getting paid in lieu of taking leave?
No, that's to cover the cost of those holidays as and when they would be taken.
Is that not already foreseen in part of our plan?
It's something that you have to look at every year because, you know, an individual has a leave entitlement of whatever number of days they have. This year end, they may have taken all of their leave, so there wouldn't be any accrued element. The previous year, they may have taken all of their leave other than 2 days, and you would need to accrue for that 2-day element where the leave could be taken in the following year, but you accrue for the costs in the year in which the leave, you know, the pay falls.
Okay, thanks, Trevor. Thanks, Chair.
Right, Trevor, in turn, we'll go back to this budget table again.
Okay.
Would it be possible to also add in a separate column for Invest NI's historical resource budget allocation and actual spend as well?
Certainly.
When you're giving us the revised table, can you add in a column for Invest NI? That's it, then we'll let you go and enjoy.
Page 29, Chair. 28.
It's 20. It's a revised table 29. They're giving us, yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Aye. That's it, Trevor.
Okay. Thank you very much. Sure. Thank you.
Members, move on to agenda item number 9. At page 73 is a research paper which provides a review of literature regarding the determinants of foreign direct investment. Are members content to receive a briefing from the Assembly Research on the paper when a decision on the transfer of corporation tax has been announced?
Great.
Members content to forward the paper to the Committee for Finance and Personnel and to the Department for their information.
Great.
Agenda item number 10, EU Matters newsletter. Keep going, Gordon. So page 91 here. Members, any comments or content to note?
Great.
So on agenda item number 11, number 12, there's a written briefing from Daddy in the Programme for Government 2011 to 2015 Year 3 Quarter 2 Progress Report. And the Progress Report is at page 111 on. Members, any comments or content to note?
Noted.
Agenda item 13, the consultation on proposals in relation to 3 health and safety approved codes of practice, and these are pages 133 on. Members, any comments or content with the proposals? On Gordon. Agenda item number 14, correspondence. There are 4 items of correspondence included in your papers. The index is at page 142, and the papers are from pages 143 to 162. Members content with the suggested actions for the items in the index?
Yep, I agree.
Table today is correspondence from the Minister regarding consultation on the implementation of Directive 2013/30/EU, and this is at page 37 of your tabled papers. Members content with the proposals?
Great.
Agenda item number 14, any other business. Table today is a consultation document regarding proposals for the replacement of the Construction Design and Management Regulations of 2007, and this is at page 40 of your tabled papers. Are members content to receive a summary of responses once the consultation closes?
Yep.
Great.
Members, any other additional items of business? Definitely not, Gordon.
Definitely not.
Agenda item number 15, the date, time and place of the next meeting. The next meeting of the committee will be held on Tuesday the 13th of January 2015 in room 29 of Parliament Buildings at 10 a.m. Agreed?
Great.
Absolutely.
You should elevate Gordon.